Hey, you're listening to Night Tide. Tonight I'll walk you through something that probably sounds familiar the moment you hear it. You slept, you rested, you had a quiet day, and you still woke up tired. Or you ended a weekend feeling somehow more depleted than when it started. That specific texture of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't respond to sleep, is what this whole conversation is built around. Not as a medical question, as a philosophical and psychological one. Write in the comments what time it is for you right now, or just how your day went. There are genuinely warm and thoughtful people in the Night Tide comments, and reading them is one of the better parts of running this. If the project means something to you, there's a link in the description where you can support it. Now, the tiredness that persists through rest. There's something deeply strange about it, and the strangeness is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Most frameworks we're handed for understanding fatigue are built around a fairly clean equation. Output depletes, rest restores, the system resets. That model works for muscles. It works for sleep debt in a narrow technical sense. It mostly fails for the kind of tiredness that accumulates, not in the body during a hard week, but somewhere less locatable. The kind you carry without being able to point to what caused it. What makes this philosophically interesting and psychologically urgent is that the exhaustion many people live with daily does not map onto anything they did. There was no marathon. There was no all-nighter. There was a normal sequence of days, reasonable by most measures, and at the end of it, something inside felt worn through. The standard explanation, you just need more rest, turns out to be exactly the thought that keeps people from asking the question that might actually matter. Because rest and recovery are not the same process. They share some overlap, and they're spoken about as though they're interchangeable, but they operate on different systems, and they require entirely different conditions. Rest, in the most direct sense, is the cessation of effort. You stop. You lie down. You reduce demand on the body and the mind. Recovery is something else. It is the process by which what was depleted actually gets restored. And recovery requires conditions that rest alone cannot provide. Safety is one of those conditions. Not safety in a dramatic sense, not the absence of physical threat, but the deeper felt sense that nothing requires your vigilance right now. That there is no problem waiting just beyond the edge of your awareness that you are responsible for holding together. The nervous system, when genuinely offline, can do its repair work. When it is not genuinely offline, when it is idling rather than resting, monitoring at low frequency rather than fully released, sleep happens, hours pass, the morning comes, and the restoration that was supposed to follow simply doesn't. You can be horizontal for 8 hours while the part of you that never stops working continues to work. That part has no off switch tied to posture or darkness or the formal circumstances of a night in bed. It runs on something older and harder to reach than the decisions you make about your schedule.
Meaning is another condition recovery requires. This one is less intuitive and more important. There is a substantial tradition across multiple philosophical frameworks, and the psychology increasingly catches up to it, that locates a specific kind of fatigue, not in the quantity of effort, but in its relationship to value. When what fills your hours feels genuinely yours, connected to something you recognize as mattering, to a life that in some sense reflects who you actually are, the expenditure of energy is a different transaction. When that connection is absent or attenuated, the same actions, requiring the same physical output, produce a residue. Not guilt, exactly, not dissatisfaction in any simple form. Something more like a slow leak, a sense that energy is going out and something necessary is not coming back in. This is why two people can have identical schedules and report completely different levels of fatigue. The external accounting, hours worked, hours slept, social obligations met, tasks completed, says the same thing about both of them. The interior accounting says something entirely different. Permission is the third condition, and it may be the most systematically undermined. Recovery requires that you believe, somewhere below the level of reasoning, that rest is legitimate, that the time spent doing nothing productive is not a withdrawal on some account you cannot afford to touch, that your value does not depend on your visible output during every hour of the day. A large portion of contemporary culture works against that belief with considerable sophistication, not through direct argument, but through the slow accumulation of signals that frame inactivity as failure and stillness as waste. When the organism pauses under those conditions, it does not enter recovery. It enters a suspended state. The effort has stopped, but the psychological architecture that makes effort feel necessary has not. The self remains on call, and what is on call cannot heal. The macro question this opens, and it will stay open across everything that follows, is whether the tiredness you carry is a problem with your capacity, your constitution, your choices about how you spend your time, or whether it is a signal, something that has been accumulating not because you are failing to manage your life correctly, but because the life itself, or some central condition of it, requires something from you that more sleep will never address. That question has no comfortable answer, and the discomfort is the point. Rest and recovery are not synonyms. That claim needs to be held carefully, because the difference between them is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. When you treat them as the same process, every attempt to restore yourself through rest becomes a version of the same action that has already been failing. You add more of what does not work and wonder why the result stays the same. Rest is a cessation. Something stops. The body becomes horizontal, the schedule clears, the demands go quiet. That much is real, and it matters. But cessation is not the same as repair. You can stop an engine without fixing it. The stopping is a precondition, not the mechanism. Recovery is the mechanism, the active process by which what has been depleted is genuinely rebuilt. And it requires conditions that are entirely separate from the fact of stopping. The first of those conditions is psychological permission. Not a conscious decision to relax, not a deliberate choice to be present, but something more foundational. A deep-level belief that the pause is legitimate, that the self is not in deficit for being still, that something important will not collapse while you are absent from effort. This belief, for a significant portion of people living inside systems that equate productivity with worth, is one they do not actually hold, even when they tell themselves otherwise. The verbal permission is there, the somatic permission, the felt sense of being genuinely released, is somewhere they have not been able to reach. And when that deeper permission is absent, the body can complete a full night of sleep without the self ever going offline. The physiological processes run their course, duration is met. What does not occur is the withdrawal of the monitoring function, the background process that scans for threat, for unresolved problems, for the thing that still needs to be handled. That function does not require waking consciousness to operate. It runs beneath it, persistent and low-grade, a form of vigilance that asks nothing of your attention while it consumes it.
The word recovery in ordinary usage sounds passive, something that happens to you while you wait. The reality is closer to the opposite. Recovery is a state the system enters only when certain thresholds are crossed, and those thresholds are not crossed simply by removing activity. Safety must be genuinely registered, not merely declared. The nervous system makes that determination through a process that does not respond to argument or intention. You can know cognitively that there is nothing wrong, that the work will wait, that the crisis has passed, and still not cross the threshold, because knowing and registering are different operations running on different circuitry. This is where the tiredness you cannot explain through your schedule begins to make a different kind of sense. The question was never only how much you have been doing, it was always also, what is the system's baseline assessment of its situation? Is it genuinely released, or is it managing a low-grade state of alert that rest has not touched? Meaning works as a recovery condition in a way that is harder to articulate and easier to feel. When the things that fill your time carry a quality of genuine belonging, when they connect, even loosely, to something you recognize as yours, the expenditure of energy in them is different in character. There is something returned in the exchange, not immediately, and not always consciously, but the transaction has a both-directional quality. Something goes out, and something, in some form, comes back. When that connection is thin or absent, the exchange becomes one-directional. In a way, the body registers, but the calendar does not. The hours look the same from outside. The output looks the same. What accumulates inside is different, a kind of depletion that has no obvious sort, and therefore no obvious remedy. You cannot point to it in the schedule. You cannot remove it by adjusting the schedule. It belongs to a layer of the self that is not addressed by any reorganization of tasks.
The philosopher William James, working in the late 19th century, observed that fatigue in humans was not a simple mechanical quantity, not a measure of how much had been spent, but something entangled with the meaning the expenditure carried. The same amount of work, done in one psychological register, exhausts. Done in another, it sustains. James was writing before the vocabulary of psychology had crystallized around these ideas, but the observation has not dated. The question it raises, what is the register of your expenditure, and are you aware of it, is one that no amount of additional sleep resolves on its own. Safety, meaning, permission, these are not soft conditions, not the language of wellness categories. They are functional requirements for a process that will not complete without them. Their absence does not produce a partial recovery that is better than nothing. Their absence prevents recovery from initiating at all. The system pauses. The repair cycle does not open. The morning arrives with the deficit intact. What remains genuinely unclear, and this is the boundary where the analysis has to stop rather than speculate, is how much access any individual person has to changing those conditions from inside the situation they are already in. Knowing that your recovery requires genuine felt safety does not automatically produce that safety. Understanding that the meaning register of your actions is depleting you does not by itself alter the actions or the register. The gap between the diagnosis and the available response is real, and it does not close simply because the diagnosis becomes accurate. That gap is where the tiredness lives. Not in the hours, not in the schedule, in the distance between what rest can provide and what recovery actually requires. There is a specific way the threat detection system behaves during sleep that most accounts of rest never reach. Sleep architecture, the sequencing of light sleep, deep sleep, and REM cycles across a night, can be technically intact. The durations can be right, the cycles can complete,
The brain can pass through every stage it is supposed to pass through. And in the morning, the person waking up can feel as though none of it happened. The reason is not in the structure of the sleep, it is in what the nervous system was doing while the sleep occurred. The threat detection apparatus in the human nervous system, built across an evolutionary timescale that has nothing to do with contemporary circumstances, operates on a principle that is simple and absolute. While the threat assessment is running, the system is not fully offline. Partial vigilance is still vigilance. A low-grade monitoring signal is still a monitoring signal. The sleep cycles complete around it, but the restoration that sleep is capable of producing requires a condition that the monitoring signal prevents: genuine neural withdrawal from the task of environmental assessment.
What this means practically is that the threshold for the nervous system to register actual safety is not the same as the threshold for falling asleep. These are separate thresholds with separate triggers, and they can diverge significantly. You can be tired enough to fall asleep while remaining at a level below conscious awareness, in a state of alert. The body is down, the system is not. The cycles run, the monitoring runs alongside them, and the window in which deep neurological repair occurs either narrows substantially or does not open at all. The distinction between perceived safety and actual safety, registered safety, felt safety, the kind the nervous system accepts rather than the kind you can reason yourself into, is where this becomes philosophically, and not just neurologically, significant. Knowing that you are safe is a cognitive operation. Registering safety is a somatic one. The two processes use different pathways and are not reliably synchronized. You can inventory the situation before sleep. You can confirm, rationally and accurately, that nothing urgent is pending, that no threat is present, that the morning will not bring a crisis that requires preparation tonight. That inventory is real. The nervous system may receive none of it, because the assessment it is running is not based on your evaluation of the present situation. It is based on the accumulated pattern of what situations like this one have meant across weeks or months or years. It is pattern matching at a depth where conscious reassurance does not reach. This is one of the more disorienting features of the kind of tiredness that sleep does not touch. The cause is invisible during the night and absent from the morning. There is no event to point to. There was no nightmare, no restlessness that you remember, nothing that felt wrong about the night. The sleep, from the outside, looked fine. The exhaustion is real, and the explanation is nowhere the eyes can find it. The structural principle here extends well beyond sleep hygiene or the mechanics of any single night. When the threat assessment system is chronically active at low levels, not in response to a specific threat, but as a kind of baseline setting, a learned posture toward the world, then the recovery window does not simply close on one night. It remains effectively inaccessible for as long as that baseline holds. The system will complete its cycles. The person will accumulate nights of sleep. The debt will not close, because the condition that would allow the debt to close has not been met. There is a term in psychophysiology, allostatic load, that refers to the cumulative cost of chronic stress on the body's regulatory systems. The idea is that sustained activation, even at levels below what would register as acute stress, wears on the system's capacity to return to equilibrium. The body can adapt, but adaptation has a price, and the price compounds. Sleep does not reset that accumulation. It cannot, because the accumulation is not a single night's deficit. It is a structural shift in where the baseline sits. The limit of this principle appears when you ask what exactly is maintaining the elevated threat detection baseline for a given person. Sometimes the answer is identifiable.
a genuinely difficult external situation, a relationship under sustained strain, a context that reliably produces the signals the system reads as requiring vigilance. In those cases, the nervous system's behavior is accurate, in a functional sense. It is responding to something real, and the fact that the response is costly does not make it mistaken.
The principle becomes harder to apply when the source of the activation is not a current external situation, but an internalized one. A standard of self-evaluation that produces low-grade threat signals when it is not being met. A pattern of anticipatory monitoring, scanning for what might go wrong before it does, that has become so habitual, the system runs it whether or not there is any particular content to scan for. In these cases, the threat system is not responding to the world as it is responding to a world it has been trained to expect, and no amount of evidence to the contrary updates that training quickly. What this means for the tiredness you wake up with is genuinely unsettling. The sleep was real, the time was spent, the cycles completed. And the thing that would have allowed the sleep to do its work, the actual offline status of the system that evaluates threat, may never have occurred. The question then is not how to sleep more, or differently, or with better conditions around the sleep. The question is what it would take for the nervous system to genuinely believe, below the level of argument, that the night is safe. That question reaches much further than a bedroom. Where the analysis holds its limit is this: even a precise understanding of the mechanism does not automatically produce access to it. Knowing that your threat detection system is maintaining a baseline that prevents deep restoration is useful information. It does not, by itself, lower the baseline. The gap between comprehension and the physiological reality is exactly the kind of gap that makes this kind of tiredness so resistant. Not to understanding, but to resolution through understanding alone. There is a specific kind of tiredness that has no event at its origin. No sprint, no crisis, no night of insufficient sleep. It arrives after periods of sustained holding, when you have been keeping something in place that wanted to move, or keeping something quiet that wanted to be heard. The expenditure is invisible during the day. The fatigue is visible the next morning. Suppression is the term, but it is worth being precise about what the word actually names. It is not merely the decision not to say something. It is the continuous muscular and neurological work of maintaining that decision across time, of monitoring the impulse, containing it, rerouting whatever energy it was carrying into a holding pattern rather than a release. That work does not stop when the conversation ends, or the meeting concludes, or the situation passes. The holding continues because the thing being held has not resolved. It has only been rerouted. Here is where the common assumption deserves scrutiny. Most models of fatigue, the intuitive ones, the ones that guide how people think about what they need, assume that tiredness is proportional to output. You did more, you are more tired. You did less, you are less tired. Rest, on this model, works by interrupting output. Stop doing things, and the deficit closes. The logic is coherent, and it applies accurately to a real category of tiredness. It simply does not apply to this one. Suppression does not reduce output. It redirects it. The energy that would have been expressed as a reaction, a refusal, a disclosure, an emotional response, is instead diverted into the maintenance of a state that prevents the expression. The result is that the body's energy systems are running continuous expenditure with no external correlate. Nothing visible is produced. The effort never appears in anyone's account of what happened that day. And yet,
The cost is real, ongoing, and cumulative in a way that ordinary exertion is not. Because ordinary exertion has a natural end point. Suppression, maintained across hours or days or longer, does not. You can feel this distinction if you have ever reached the end of a day in which almost nothing happened, no physical demand, no intense cognitive work, and still found yourself exhausted in a way that felt heavier and stranger than the ordinary fatigue of a busy day. The calendar would not explain it. The schedule would not explain it. The explanation lives in what the day required you to hold, and in the fact that holding something continuously is not the same as holding nothing. The physiological dimension of this is straightforward enough. The sustained activation of the nervous system's regulatory mechanisms, the systems responsible for inhibiting response, for managing arousal without expressing it, has a measurable cost. It is not simply psychological strain in the loose, colloquial sense. It is the actual consumption of the same resources that the body needs for repair, for immune function, for cognitive recovery. When those resources are being drawn on continuously for the work of containment, they are not available for the work of restoration. Rest arrives, but the systems that rest is supposed to restore are still occupied. The complication arrives when you try to measure how much of this is happening to you on any given day. That is, in a functional sense, its purpose. Suppression works precisely because it does not appear in the external record. The person doing it often cannot feel it as effort while it is occurring. The signal of expenditure is muted. What is available is the accumulated result, the heaviness that has no story attached, the fatigue that cannot be explained to anyone who asks what you did today. What makes this form of tiredness more persistent than physical fatigue is the absence of the discharge cycle. Physical exertion, even intense exertion, has a structure: activation, expenditure, depletion, recovery. The body knows how to process the sequence because the sequence completes. Suppression interrupts the sequence before the expenditure stage, which means the activation energy has nowhere to go. It does not complete. It does not discharge. It accumulates, and it continues to require maintenance even after the original situation that generated it has passed. There is a particular weight to suppressed emotional material, specifically as distinct from suppressed preferences, reactions, or opinions, because emotional states carry physiological momentum. The anger that was not expressed, the grief that was managed rather than felt, the fear that was held in a state of controlled suspension. Each of these involves a body-level preparation that was initiated and then arrested. The preparation does not simply disappear when the arrest is maintained. The arrested state persists at a lower intensity, and the work of keeping it at lower intensity, rather than letting it complete its cycle, is continuous. This is part of what makes sleep so inadequate as a remedy for this category of exhaustion. Sleep can interrupt the conscious maintenance effort. It cannot access the underlying state that is being maintained. You go to sleep holding something. The conscious part of the holding relaxes. The somatic part, the tension in the regulatory system, the incomplete discharge cycle, continues. The sleep cycles run around it. You wake up, and the held thing is still there, and the expenditure on its behalf continues from where it left off before the night. The transition principle this points toward is one that the common account of tiredness has no room for. If fatigue were proportional to output, the remedy would always be to reduce output. If fatigue can accumulate from the sustained containment of what was not expressed or processed,
then the question of what restores a person changes in character. It is no longer only a question of what to stop doing. It becomes, among other things, a question of what is being held, what has been rerouted instead of released, and whether the accumulated cost of that holding is being counted anywhere at all. Most accounts of why people are tired leave that column empty. The column is not empty. The moment rest becomes something you are supposed to do correctly, it has already changed into something else. That shift is not dramatic. It arrives quietly, often dressed in the language of self-care or intention. You decide to rest properly this time. You put the phone in another room. You dim the lights. You give yourself a window, an hour, a morning, a full weekend, and you fill it with the activities that are supposed to produce the outcome. The list is familiar. No screens, no obligations, something slow, something that does not demand. And then you follow the list, and the tiredness does not lift, and there is a faint but persistent sense that you have failed at something that should have been impossible to fail at.
The paradox is precise. Rest that is organized around an outcome is structured exactly like the activities rest is meant to interrupt. There is a goal. There is a method for reaching the goal. There is a background assessment running throughout, measuring whether the method is working and whether the goal is being approached. That background assessment is the same process that runs during every other performance in your day. It is what makes work feel like work. And it does not turn off when the content of the activity changes from a spreadsheet to a walk in the park. This is worth naming directly because the intuition that resting correctly should produce recovery is not irrational. It derives from a reasonable observation about how physical recovery operates. After physical exertion, the body does respond to specific conditions: adequate sleep, adequate nutrition, reduction of further load. The conditions can be identified, pursued, and measured, and the recovery follows with some reliability. The model is accurate within its domain. The problem arises when the same model is applied to a different kind of tiredness, the kind that is not produced by output, but by performance in the broader sense. The continuous work of monitoring, managing, and meeting standards, including the standard of resting well. When you attempt to optimize your recovery, the optimization itself is an act of self-monitoring. Someone is watching the process. Someone is evaluating whether the conditions are right, whether the method is correct, whether the rest is working. That someone is you, doing the same background labor that was running all day. The content of the monitoring has shifted. You are now monitoring the quality of your rest, rather than the quality of your work. But the structure of the monitoring is identical. The machinery has not been suspended. It has been redirected toward a new object, and the new object is the attempt to shut it down. There is a thinker whose work is useful here. Byung-Chul Han, a philosopher whose writing on exhaustion and performance culture is one of the sharper analyses of this specific terrain, argues that the achievement subject, the person who has internalized the imperative to optimize, produce, and perform, cannot truly rest because the subject position itself is one of continuous self-management. Rest, in this framing, requires the suspension of the subject as manager of itself. But the subject does not know how to suspend that function because the function has become constitutive of how the self operates. Attempting to rest while remaining a self that manages its own rest is structurally self-defeating. The consequence of this is not simply that the rest fails. The failure generates its own cost. You tried to rest. The rest did not work. The interpretation available, within the framework of optimized self-management, is that you did not rest correctly. The method was wrong. The conditions were wrong.
You did not commit fully enough to the process. And so, the next attempt at rest arrives already loaded with the history of the previous failure and the intention to correct for it. The intention to correct is itself a performance posture. The new attempt begins from a higher level of self-monitoring than the last one. The cycle compounds.
What makes resolution genuinely impossible here is that the escape route requires abandoning the framework that makes the problem legible. If the problem is identified as failing to rest correctly, then the solution must be a better resting method, which reinstates the performance structure. The only exit is to stop framing rest as something that can be done correctly or incorrectly, which means abandoning the evaluative stance entirely. And the evaluative stance is not a habit that can be set aside through a decision, any more than the threat detection system discussed earlier can be switched off through an act of reasoning. It runs below the level where decisions operate. The performance of rest is not a personal weakness or a failure of insight. It is the predictable outcome of a framework that has been applied comprehensively enough to reach into the recovery space itself. When productivity has been internalized, not just as a work value, but as a criterion for the worth of time, when unstructured, purposeless, unmeasured time feels uncomfortable rather than natural, then rest will reliably be converted into a productivity-adjacent activity. It will be given structure, purpose, a measurable form. And in being given those things, it will lose the quality that made it potentially restorative. The question this leaves you with is one that cannot be answered by technique. If the performance structure is what prevents genuine rest, and if the structure cannot be dismantled by a decision to dismantle it, then the recovery you are looking for is not available through the addition of a new method. Adding a better method is adding more structure. The thing that might interrupt the cycle is not a technique for resting correctly, but something prior to technique, a different relationship to the activity of self-evaluation itself. What that relationship looks like, and whether it is available given everything that has shaped the way you currently occupy your own experience, is a question the restful weekend is not equipped to answer. There is a process running in you right now that you are almost certainly not aware of. It has been running since you woke up, probably since before that. It does not announce itself, does not register as effort, does not appear in any account of what you have done today. And yet it consumes something, continuously, in the background, at a cost that accumulates across hours and days without ever being entered into the calculation of why you might be tired. The process is self-monitoring, the tracking of how you are coming across, whether your expression is matching what you intend to communicate, whether the version of you that is visible to others is the version you need it to be, whether the version of you that is visible to yourself is one you can tolerate. That tracking is not something you do occasionally and then set aside. It runs as a background process beneath everything else, beneath the work, beneath the conversation, beneath the rest, beneath the quiet moments you set aside specifically to stop performing. It does not stop when the performance stops, because one of the things it monitors is the quality of the stopping. So the question worth sitting with is this. If that process is running continuously, what is it costing you? And why does no one count it?
The tension here is not simply about social anxiety or self-consciousness in the clinical sense. Those are recognizable states with names and frameworks and treatment approaches. What we are talking about is something more foundational, the ordinary, non-pathological labor of managing your legibility to yourself and to others. Every person who inhabits a social world does this. Every person who cares at all about how they are received, what they are communicating, whether they are understood, which is essentially everyone, is running some version of this process. The variation is in intensity and rigidity, not in kind. The intensity increases in conditions where the cost of misreading is perceived as high. A professional environment where impression management has real consequences. A relationship where emotional attunement is under pressure. A context where the version of you that is acceptable is narrower than the version of you that exists. In each of these situations, the monitoring sharpens, the feedback loop tightens, and the energy consumed by the process rises without any external signal that effort is being expended. You are sitting still. You are in a conversation. You are performing no physical task, and the monitoring is running at a cost that would exhaust you if you could measure it, which you cannot, because the process is designed to be invisible even to the person running it. This is the specific quality that makes self-monitoring labor so difficult to account for. Physical effort leaves evidence. You lifted something, your muscles register it. You ran, your cardiovascular system registers it. You worked intensively at a cognitive task. The depletion of focused attention is perceptible, at least in retrospect. But self-monitoring leaves nothing in the external record and produces only a subtle, diffuse signal in the internal one. The signal tends to manifest not as a clear sense of having worked hard, but as a vague difficulty settling, a low-level restlessness, a tiredness that does not match anything you can point to when you try to trace its origin. Someone who spends a day in a series of meetings where they were managing how they were being perceived, tracking every response, adjusting every statement for how it might land, maintaining a particular version of composure or competence or warmth, will reach the end of that day depleted in a way that a day of demanding physical labor might not produce. The calendar will show meetings. The record will show nothing particularly strenuous. The person will be unable to explain the depth of their exhaustion without sounding as though they are exaggerating, because the accounting system in use does not have a line for what they were actually doing. The insight that follows from this is not comfortable. If the cost is real but invisible, if the labor is genuine but unrecorded, then every calculation a person makes about their own tiredness is working from incomplete data. You are measuring your output and comparing it to your exhaustion and finding the equation doesn't balance, and you conclude that something is wrong with you, your constitution, your resilience, your capacity for ordinary functioning. The conclusion is wrong. The equation is incomplete. The missing variable is the ongoing expenditure on the work of appearing, tracking, and managing. The labor that runs beneath the visible labor and is never counted in the final total.
There is a particular sharpening of this process in conditions of perceived evaluation. When you sense, correctly or not, that you are being assessed, the monitoring intensifies and becomes more consuming. The attention that would otherwise be available for the task at hand splits. Part of it remains with the task, and part of it attaches to the question of how the task is being received, how you are being seen doing it, whether the performance of competence or ease or engagement is landing the way you need it to. That split is not voluntary. It is not a choice you make in the moment. It is the outcome of a nervous system that has learned to treat evaluation as a condition requiring heightened vigilance. The human cost of running this process continuously is something that rests cannot address in the ordinary sense. Sleep can interrupt the conscious layer of the monitoring. What it cannot do is dissolve the underlying orientation.
the habituated attentiveness to external and internal appraisal that runs as a near-permanent feature of how a person inhabits their own experience. You sleep, and the monitoring pauses in the way that any background process pauses when the machine is powered down. You wake up, and the process resumes, because nothing that happens during sleep addresses the conditions that make the process necessary. The morning tiredness is not a failure of sleep quality. It is the cost of the monitoring re-establishing itself within the first minutes of consciousness. The partial resolution, and it is genuinely partial, is the recognition that this labor exists and that it carries a cost. Not a solution in any practical sense, because recognition alone does not dissolve the conditions that require the monitoring to run. But there is a meaningful difference between carrying an unaccounted weight and knowing the weight exists. When the exhaustion arrives without explanation, the mind will fill the explanatory gap with whatever is available. Usually something about personal inadequacy, insufficient discipline, a constitution too fragile for ordinary demands. Knowing that the gap can be partially explained by an invisible and continuous expenditure is not the same as relieving the expenditure. It is the difference between a ledger with a missing line and one that acknowledges something is there, even if the full sum cannot yet be calculated. What remains unresolved is the deeper question of what it would take for the monitoring to reduce in intensity, whether that is possible within the conditions that are generating it, or whether those conditions would need to change first. The monitoring is not an arbitrary habit. It is calibrated to an environment. If the environment continues to require it, wanting to stop is not the same as being able to. There is a concept that does not have a single established name in mainstream psychology, though the phenomenon it describes is widely recognized by those who have spent time thinking carefully about the relationship between action and identity. The concept is this: when a person spends sustained time doing things that are disconnected from what they actually value, something depletes. The depletion is not guilt. It is not regret. It is not the particular heaviness that follows a specific act of moral compromise. It is something more diffuse and more total, a draining of something that functions like fuel, but whose source is not caloric or even cognitive. The source appears to be identity itself.
Call it meaning debt. The term is useful because it captures something about accumulation. Debt does not announce itself at the moment it is incurred. You make a transaction, the resources leave, and the deficit registers later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes only when you try to draw on reserves you assumed were still there, and find they are not. Meaning debt operates with the same delay. A single day of work that feels hollow does not produce collapse. A week of it produces a low-grade flatness that is easy to explain away. A month of it, a year of it, the accumulation crosses a threshold, and the exhaustion that arrives is disproportionate to any single identifiable cause. Because the cause is not any single event, it is the running total. The scale of this as a claim is significant. What is being said here is that identity coherence, the degree to which your actions align with your values, is not merely a philosophical or ethical matter. It is an energetic one. The person who spends their days acting in ways that feel genuinely expressive of what they care about, genuinely continuous with who they understand themselves to be, draws on a different kind of resort than the person who spends those same hours in a version of themselves that they do not recognize or endorse. Both people may be working equally hard in any external, measurable sense. The exhaustion they carry home is not equal. Now narrow this to a specific case, because the general claim risks becoming too abstract to be useful. Take someone who is good at a job
they do not care about. This is not a rare situation. The competence is real. The performance is credible. The person meets expectations, often exceeds them, is recognized for the quality of their output. From the outside, there is nothing to diagnose. From the inside, there is a sustained cost that the external picture does not capture. Every act of competence, in the service of something that does not feel meaningful, is a transaction that withdraws from the reserves without depositing anything back. The withdrawal is not dramatic. It is small, regular, and cumulative. And because the competence is real, the person cannot locate the exhaustion in failure. They are succeeding by every visible criterion. The tiredness seems to have no legitimate source, which makes it feel like evidence of a personal deficiency rather than evidence of a real and nameable process.
The gap between the large claim and this specific case is where something important lives. Because in the general form, sustained disconnection from values produces depletion, there is no indication of how fast the debt accumulates, or what the threshold looks like, or whether different people incur the debt at different rates. The specific case reveals a complication. Competence can mask the process even from the person experiencing it. If you are doing the work well, the feedback you receive, from external sources, from your own sense of having performed adequately, creates a signal that reads like adequacy. The signal is not false, exactly. The work was done. The standard was met. What the signal cannot carry is the information about what the meeting of that standard is costing at the level of identity coherence. Performance and depletion run in parallel, and the performance data does not include depletion data. This is what makes meaning debt systemically invisible, in a way that physical fatigue is not. Physical fatigue has an obvious and traceable relationship to its causes. You can point to the exertion, the duration, the inadequate recovery, and construct a narrative that accounts for the tiredness. The person has slept. The person has not been working excessively by any standard measure. The person may have had, objectively speaking, a relatively uneventful stretch of days. And yet, the feeling of being drained is persistent, specific, and resistant to the interventions that should address it. Because the interventions being applied are calibrated to replenish resources that rest can address, while the actual deficit is in a different account entirely. What this means at the level of how you understand your own tiredness is something that deserves real attention. The diagnostic framework most people apply when they try to explain their exhaustion is built around visible effort. You look at what you did, estimate its demands, compare those demands to what you feel, and either find a match or conclude that something is wrong with your capacity. That framework is inadequate to meaning debt, because meaning debt is not produced by demand level. It is produced by alignment level. A highly demanding day spent doing something that feels genuinely yours can leave you tired in a way that feels clean, the kind of tired that does not trouble you when it arrives. A low-demand day spent going through motions that belong to someone else's sense of what your life should look like can leave you with a deeper and more disturbing exhaustion, one that sleep does not clear and that comes back the next morning already present. The philosophical tradition that approaches this most directly is not any single school, though Viktor Frankl's work on meaning and survival, and more broadly, the existentialist attention to authenticity, both circle the same territory. What those frameworks tend to emphasize is the centrality of meaning to psychological functioning, not as an optional enhancement, but as a structural requirement. Remove it, and something that ordinarily operates as a given begins to require active work to substitute for its absence. The substitution is costly. Living in ways that are systematically discontinuous with what gives your life meaning is not simply unsatisfying. It is,
in a quite precise sense, laborious. The labor of maintaining a functional self in the absence of the conditions that would make that self-maintenance natural rather than effortful.
So the question that opens up from here is one that does not resolve cleanly. If meaning debt accumulates through actions disconnected from values, the obvious prescription is to close that gap, to find ways to act that are more continuous with who you actually are. And that prescription is not wrong, exactly, but it assumes a degree of freedom that the specific case complicates immediately. The person who is good at a job they do not care about is not, in most cases, remaining in that situation through pure inertia. There are reasons, there are dependencies, obligations, conditions that are not easily rearranged. And the recognition that meaning debt is real does not automatically generate the conditions under which it can be addressed. The debt is named. The creditor does not disappear because it has been named. Whether that naming is the beginning of something or merely a more accurate account of the same exhaustion is a question that stays open. Rumination is often described as excessive thinking, a word that implies the problem is quantity, that the mind is simply doing too much of something that would otherwise be useful. That description is inaccurate in a way that matters. The distinction is not about volume, it is about direction. Thinking moves. It takes a question, applies something to it, and arrives somewhere different from where it started. Not always at a solution, but at a new position relative to the problem. Rumination does not move. It returns. It replays the same material at the same point in the loop, passes through the same unresolved nodes, and arrives back at the beginning without having changed anything about the situation or about the person's relationship to it. The energy consumed is real. The displacement is zero. This distinction carries a consequence that most accounts of tiredness miss entirely. If rumination is a loop rather than a process, then the conditions that enable it are not the same as the conditions that enable productive thought. Focused cognitive work requires active engagement. It responds to input. It can be redirected. It can be interrupted. Rumination requires only one thing: unoccupied attention. And the condition most reliably associated with unoccupied attention is rest. So when you stop, when you lie down, when the day quiets, when the obligations recede, and the surface-level busyness that has been filling the hours is removed, you have not removed the source of the rumination. You have removed the only thing that was interrupting it. The loop that has been running beneath the day's activity continues. It now runs without competition. Quiet does not dissolve unresolved material. It clears the field so that unresolved material can occupy it completely. This is why many people report that they feel worse on days off than on ordinary working days. The working day provides enough external demand that the loop is crowded out, not resolved, but displaced. When the displacement ends, the loop returns with the same intensity it had before, and sometimes more, because the absence of external structure removes the only scaffolding that was keeping it from dominating the field of attention. You wake up from a long sleep feeling not restored, but already burdened, as though something was waiting for you and did not take your absence personally. The psychological literature on this is specific enough to be useful here. Bloomer-Zygarnik's work in the 1920s demonstrated that the mind holds incomplete tasks differently from completed ones, with a kind of open tension, a persistent readiness to return to them. What later research extended and complicated is the degree to which this applies not just to tasks, but to emotionally unresolved situations. Relationships with indeterminate outcomes, conflicts that were interrupted rather than settled. These open structures do not simply wait in memory, they consume something, a portion of the processing capacity that would otherwise be available for other use. And they do so continuously, regardless of whether the person is consciously thinking about them. The consequence for tiredness is that the drain is not limited to the hours when you are actively engaged with whatever is unresolved. It runs in the background during work, during conversation, during distraction, and, critically, during rest. The rest that does not address the unresolved loop does not stop the loop from running. It stops other processes from running alongside it, which can make the loop more perceptible and its cost more apparent, but it does not reduce the cost. The meter continues. This is a meaningful refinement of how to understand what is happening when rest fails to restore. The usual model treats the body and mind as containers that need to be refilled. Rest is the filling, activity is the depletion, and the problem, when rest fails, is assumed to be a failure of the filling process. The alternative model, which the structure of rumination suggests more accurately, is that the container has a leak. The leak is the open loop. The filling continues to happen, sleep, pause, recovery conditions, but the gain is offset by the continuous drain from material that remains unresolved. You can rest adequately in every technical sense and still wake up less than full because something has been running continuously through the night. What makes this particularly difficult is that the loop's subject matter often cannot be resolved through the kind of effort that would ordinarily address a problem. The things that generate rumination tend to be situations of genuine ambiguity, relational complexity, or unresolvable uncertainty. The relationship that is unclear, the decision that cannot be unmade, the situation that requires someone else to change, and that someone else shows no sign of changing. These are not problems that yield to more careful thinking, because more careful thinking has already been applied. The loop is not running because insufficient analysis has been performed. It is running because the situation contains something that analysis cannot close. And so the loop continues, not as a failure of intelligence or will, but as an accurate record of genuine irresolution. There is a certain cruelty in this architecture. The very situations that are most draining, the ones that generate the most persistent background noise in the mind, are precisely the ones that cannot be resolved by the cognitive work they appear to demand. The mind keeps returning to them because they are unfinished, and they are unfinished because they cannot be finished in the way the mind is attempting to finish them. The loop is not irrational. It is the mind doing correctly what it was built to do. Hold open what is open. The problem is that what it is holding cannot be closed through the repeated attention being applied to it. The form of tiredness this produces is distinctive. It is not the tiredness of having worked hard. It is not even the tiredness of having worked long. It is the tiredness of continuous background expenditure on a process that yields nothing, like a machine left running in an empty room, consuming power without producing output. When you encounter this tiredness after what should have been adequate rest, the temptation is to conclude that the rest was insufficient and that more of it will eventually address the deficit. That conclusion leads to an increasingly frantic investment in recovery strategies that cannot reach the source of the drain. What the structure of rumination reveals is that some forms of tiredness are not calibrated to the amount of rest received. They are calibrated to whether the open loops that are consuming energy have been closed, genuinely closed, through resolution or genuine release, not merely suppressed beneath a new layer of activity. Rest that does not address the open loop is rest that occurs in the presence of a continuing drain. It may reduce other deficits. It cannot address this one. And the irresolvable question that this leaves behind is one that no amount of clearer understanding fully answers. What do you do about a loop that cannot be closed, in a mind that will not stop running it? There are two ways to hold the experience of being persistently, stubbornly tired, and they lead in completely different directions. The first is to locate the exhaustion inside yourself, something in your constitution, your tolerance, your capacity for recovery is insufficient. Other people manage. You are managing less well. The tiredness is evidence about you, your limits, your fragility, your failure to do adequately what the situation demands. The second is to locate the exhaustion in the situation itself. The conditions you are living and working within are genuinely, structurally depleting. The tiredness is an accurate physiological and psychological response to real demands that exceed what any person could absorb without cost. These two framings are not interchangeable. Each one has a distinct set of consequences that follow from it, and they cannot both be fully right at the same time.
That tension is its own source of depletion. The question of which frame is correct, whether this is about you or about the conditions, is not a question most people can answer with confidence. And the inability to answer it does not produce neutral weighting. It produces a specific kind of grinding uncertainty that runs alongside the tiredness itself, doubling the weight of it. Follow the first framing where it leads. If the tiredness belongs to you, if it is a sign of insufficient resilience, inadequate recovery habits, a weakness in how you are built, then the appropriate response is improvement. You need better sleep practices, more disciplined rest, greater emotional regulation, more effective management of stress responses. The responsibility is yours to carry, and the path forward involves doing the work of becoming someone who handles this better. There is a certain clarity in that. It is the clarity of having a task, however difficult. The clarity has a cost, though. Accepting the personal failure frame means absorbing the shame that comes with it. It means explaining your exhaustion as a deficiency in yourself when you are already depleted, applying the pressure of self-correction to someone who has no reserves from which to draw. It means, at some level, agreeing that the tiredness is something you are doing rather than something happening to you. Now follow the structural framing. If the conditions are the cause, if the demands on your attention, your performance, your self-presentation, your time, your capacity for meaning are genuinely excessive, then the appropriate response is change. Change of conditions, change of context, change of the arrangements that produce the demand. But that change is often not immediately available. Conditions are not simply adjusted because they have been correctly identified as problematic. There are dependencies, obligations, social structures, economic realities that do not yield to recognition. Knowing that the conditions are the source does not automatically generate the freedom to alter them. And so the structural framing, while it may absolve you of the shame attached to the personal one, can produce its own form of helplessness, an accurate account of a trap that naming has not opened. What is important to see is that neither framing leaves the person somewhere comfortable. The personal failure frame adds shame to the original exhaustion. The structural frame adds helplessness. Both of these are energetically costly. Both of them run as additional processes alongside whatever is already draining you. The question of which is correct is not merely philosophical. It is practically and emotionally consequential. And the uncomfortable reality is that most instances of persistent tiredness contain genuine elements of both. The conditions may be genuinely excessive, and your responses to them may also be less adaptive than they could be. Both can be true simultaneously, which means the clean resolution, the framing that tells you clearly where to direct your energy and what to do about it, is not available. What accumulates in the space between these two framings is a kind of meta-exhaustion. The tiredness of not knowing what your tiredness means, The effort of continuously auditing yourself against both frameworks simultaneously, checking whether you are failing, checking whether the conditions are fair, finding evidence for both, resolving nothing. This is not passive uncertainty. It is active work, performed continuously, without output, a process that consumes something real while producing only more of itself. There is a broader pattern visible here that psychology and philosophy both gesture toward without fully resolving. The question of agency, of how much of what happens to you is yours and how much is circumstance, is not a question that admits a stable answer. It shifts with context, with time, with what you are looking at. The person who correctly identifies structural causes can still do something with what they have. The person who correctly identifies their own role in perpetuating a difficulty still exists within conditions they did not choose. Attribution is not binary. And yet, the way human cognition tends to operate, particularly under conditions of stress and depletion, is to collapse ambiguity into one pole or the other. Because holding both simultaneously is genuinely effortful, and effort is exactly what you have least of when you are already running on insufficient reserves. The human cost of this indeterminacy is something that rarely gets named directly. The exhausted person who cannot locate their exhaustion clearly is doing something that looks, from the outside, like nothing. They are lying still. They are at rest, in the technical sense. They are not producing visible output or engaged in traceable effort. What is invisible is that they are running an attribution process that has no termination condition, a search for the correct explanation of their own state that cannot complete because the evidence genuinely supports both candidate explanations. This is not rumination in the specific sense explored before, though the structural similarity is real. The open loop here is not a situation awaiting resolution. It is a question about the self that cannot be answered with the information available, and that cannot be abandoned because the answer matters too much. What partial resolution looks like here, if it can be called resolution, is not the discovery of the correct frame. It is something more modest and more difficult. It is the recognition that holding both attributions simultaneously, even without resolving them, is a more accurate relationship to the actual situation than collapsing into either one. The personal failure frame and the structural frame are not two competing answers to a question that has one correct answer. They are two partial descriptions of something more complex than either can fully capture. The exhaustion may have causes in you and causes in the conditions, distributed in proportions that are not fixed and that change over time. Accepting that does not make the tiredness lighter. What it does is remove one specific additional burden, the burden of needing to have gotten the attribution right before you are permitted to take the exhaustion seriously.
That permission is genuinely partial. The question of which causes are yours and which are structural does not close. It continues to matter because different causes point toward different responses, and applying the wrong response to the wrong cause wastes exactly the resources you are trying to conserve. The indeterminacy is not dissolved by acknowledging it. It sits in the middle of every attempt to understand why the rest is not working, and it does not have the courtesy to resolve itself the more carefully you look at it. There is a specific interval that used to belong to no one, the gap between finishing one thing and beginning the next, the commute, the 10 minutes after eating, the stretch between getting into bed and falling asleep. These intervals were not scheduled. They were not productive. They were not even particularly noticed because nothing was happening in them that seemed worth noticing. They were simply the connective tissue of a day, the spaces in which the mind was allowed to wander without destination. That wandering was not nothing.
cognitive restoration, the process by which attention replenishes itself after sustained, directed use, does not happen during focused activity. It happens in exactly those unstructured intervals when the mind disengages from external demands and operates without a goal. The default mode network, which becomes active during rest and mind wandering, is involved in consolidating memory, integrating experience, generating the sense of narrative continuity that makes a person feel like the same person across days. It does not activate on demand. It activates in the gaps. The structural principle that follows from this is precise. The quality of your recovery is not determined solely by how much rest you accumulate in large blocks. It is also, and perhaps more significantly, determined by whether the small, unstructured intervals distributed across your day remain genuinely unoccupied. A long sleep, preceded and followed by hours of continuous attentional demand, does not produce the same restoration as the same sleep embedded in a day that permitted the mind to wander freely between tasks. The gaps matter not as a supplement to recovery, but as a constitutive part of it.
Stress tests that principle, and it holds further than might be expected. The claim is not simply that distraction is bad, or that screens are harmful in some general sense. Those are the imprecise versions of the argument. The claim is structural. The condition required for cognitive restoration is unstructured, attentional availability, and any consistent occupation of that availability, regardless of the content, interrupts the restorative process. It does not matter whether what fills the gap is stressful or pleasant, demanding or passive. What matters is whether the mind is directed at something external or left genuinely free. Passive consumption of content still directs attention outward. It still occupies the interval. The default mode network does not activate because the content is relaxing. It activates when attention is genuinely undirected. You reach for your phone in the moment the meeting ends. The walk between two rooms that might have been nothing becomes a quick scan of something. Messages, news, whatever is newest. The meal that might have involved a few minutes of unfocused quiet becomes a video, a podcast, a queue of content that arrived since the last time you checked. None of these feel like effort. They feel like the opposite of effort. That is precisely the complication. The ease of filling a gap makes its occupation invisible as a cost. The gap is filled before you have registered that a gap existed, and the restorative process that would have used it never gets started. Now consider where the principle breaks. There is a version of this argument that implies the solution is simply to leave the phone in another room, to sit with a meal without input, to allow the commute to be silent. And for some people, in some conditions, that is genuinely what is missing, and its absence is genuinely consequential. But the principle has a limit. The unoccupied gap is only restorative when the mind, left undirected, settles into genuine wandering rather than into the rumination that the preceding chunk established as a continuous background drain. An unstructured interval in the presence of an unresolved loop does not become restorative simply because no external content fills it. It becomes the space in which the loop runs more loudly. This is where the structural principle encounters its own boundary condition. The same unoccupied attention that enables cognitive restoration under one set of circumstances enables the acceleration of rumination under another. The restorative idle is not available to everyone equally, because not everyone arrives at the unoccupied interval with a mind that is genuinely ready to wander. Some arrive with open loops that will immediately claim the available attention. For them, filling the gap with passive content may be functioning not as an obstacle to restoration, but as a form of suppression, using external direction to manage what would otherwise surface. In which case,
the intervention of the attention economy into their recovery window may be compounding one problem, while, however imperfectly, managing another. That does not make the commercial occupation of the recovery window benign. What the attention economy produces is a situation in which the decision about how to use a gap is no longer made by the person the gap belongs to. The interval that opens when one thing ends and before another begins is a contested space. Contested not by the person weighing their options, but by systems designed to capture attention before the weighing can occur. The design is precise. Notifications, autoplay, infinite scroll, personalized feeds that eliminate the friction of choosing. These are not neutral tools that you happen to use. They are architectures optimized to minimize the probability that the gap goes unoccupied. The goal of the system is the elimination of the gap as an available experience. What is lost when every interval is monetized is not simply a pleasant sense of mental spaciousness. What is lost is the distributed restorative process that was making continuous, low-level repair to the attention and coherence that directed activity depletes. Large blocks of rest, 8 hours of sleep, a weekend without obligations cannot compensate for the consistent occupation of every small interval, because the small intervals were doing something the large blocks were not designed to do. They were the regular maintenance, the large blocks were the deeper servicing. When the regular maintenance stops, the system does not simply coast until the next large block. It degrades continuously in the interim, arriving at the large block in a worse state than it would otherwise have reached.
The tiredness that results from this pattern does not announce its cause. You sleep enough. You take breaks in the technical sense. You are not working continuously. The breaks exist, but the breaks are occupied, and the occupation is so habitual, so ambient, so continuous that it has ceased to register as a choice. The phone in your hand during the gap is not experienced as an intervention into your recovery. It is experienced as the natural thing to do in that moment, because the moment has been redesigned so that it feels unnatural to do nothing. What remains genuinely unresolved is whether awareness of this pattern translates into the ability to interrupt it. Knowing that the gaps have been colonized does not automatically restore them. The architecture that occupies the gaps is not only external, it has internal correlates in habits, in discomfort with genuine idleness, in the fact that for many people, an unoccupied gap has become an unfamiliar and slightly aversive experience rather than a neutral one. The gap that is no longer comfortable to inhabit cannot be recovered simply by removing the phone. Something else has changed. The capacity to be in an unstructured interval without immediately directing attention somewhere has itself been eroded. And the erosion of that capacity is not a separate problem from the tiredness. It is part of the same circuit. Stillness has been recommended for a very long time. Across different traditions, in different vocabularies, with different justifications, the prescription converges on something similar. Stop. Withdraw from activity. Allow the surface of things to quiet. Seneca wrote about the necessity of retreating into oneself. The Buddhist traditions built entire practices around the cultivation of stillness as the ground from which clarity and energy both arise. Even secular therapeutic frameworks have absorbed this idea, that the antidote to depletion lies in reduction, in the subtraction of stimulus, in learning to remain present without reaching for anything. The recommendation is ancient, widespread, and treated as close to self-evident. Stillness restores. The paradox is that this prescription fails a significant portion of the people who attempt to follow it, and it fails them in a specific and instructive way. Not because they do it incorrectly, not because they lack the discipline to sustain it, It fails because the theory of stillness as restoration assumes a condition that is not always present. And without that condition, stillness does not produce calm. It produces the opposite. What stillness actually does is remove the external structure that has been keeping certain things at the edge of awareness rather than at the center of it. During directed activity, attention has somewhere to go. The task, the conversation, the demand, these occupy the foreground of consciousness and push other material toward the periphery. Stillness withdraws the task. It withdraws the conversation and the demand. And whatever had been held at the periphery by the presence of those things moves, without invitation, into the space that opens. This is not a malfunction of stillness. It is a mechanical consequence of how directed attention works. The activity was not only producing output, it was also functioning as a container, holding suppressed material in a state of managed distance. Remove the container, and the material is no longer managed.
For someone carrying significant unresolved stress, unprocessed grief, or sustained anxiety, the kind that does not announce itself as anxiety, but simply runs as an elevated baseline, the experience of stillness is the experience of that material becoming audible. The quiet is not peaceful. It is the medium through which what has been suppressed becomes impossible to ignore. The mind that has been occupied does not, when freed, naturally drift toward rest. It drifts toward whatever it has been not quite dealing with. And it has been not quite dealing with it precisely because the occupation of activity made not quite dealing with it possible. This is why a quiet Sunday can feel worse than a demanding Wednesday. The Wednesday filled itself. The Sunday left room. And the room was immediately claimed by everything that the filling of the week had been, among other things, deferring. The philosophical traditions that recommended stillness understood this in part. Seneca was aware that the person who retreats into themselves may not find a peaceful interior. He wrote about the noise that follows a person into solitude, the internal noise that external occupation had been drowning. His solution was philosophical preparation, developing in advance the kind of interior stability that means solitude surfaces clarity rather than chaos. The Buddhist framing is structurally similar. The meditation tradition does not claim that stillness is immediately comfortable. It acknowledges that early practice brings up exactly the turbulence that busy activity has been suppressing, and it treats working through that turbulence as the necessary passage toward the stability that stillness eventually produces. The prescription for stillness was never, in its serious forms, a prescription for immediate relief. It was a prescription for a process, and the beginning of that process is frequently the most difficult part. What contemporary usage of the stillness recommendation tends to lose is exactly this complication. The idea travels through wellness culture, through generic advice about rest, through the instruction to step back from screens and sit quietly, without the accompanying understanding that stillness is only restorative after a threshold. Below that threshold, it is destabilizing. The threshold is not a fixed point. It moves depending on what you are carrying, how long you have been carrying it, and how much of it has been processed versus held. Someone who has been suppressing significant emotional material for an extended period does not approach stillness from the same position as someone whose inner life is relatively settled. For the first person, the recommendation to be still is not a path toward restoration. It is a path toward confrontation with everything they have been using activity to avoid. The consequence of this for the experience of tiredness is worth sitting with. If you are depleted,
and you attempt stillness because stillness is what is recommended, and the stillness surfaces material that has been suppressed rather than producing the calm that was promised. What you experience is not restoration. What you experience is the exhaustion of the depletion, plus the distress of what surfaces, plus the confusion of having done the right thing and felt worse. That compound experience is its own form of depletion. It does not simply leave you where you started. It leaves you in a position where the recommended path has demonstrably failed, without a clear account of why, which makes the next attempt at rest feel less safe rather than more. Safety is the precise condition that determines which experience stillness produces. Felt safety, the genuine, not performed sense that the internal and external environment is not threatening, is what allows the default mode network to operate restoratively rather than defensively. When the threat detection system is genuinely offline, unstructured attention wanders in ways that consolidate and restore. When it is not genuinely offline, when the baseline is elevated, when there is unresolved material, when the nervous system is sustaining a low-level vigilance, unstructured attention does not wander freely. It scans, it revisits, it circles what has not been resolved. The same neurological architecture that enables creative thought, emotional integration, and narrative coherence during genuine rest enables rumination and hypervigilance during threatened rest. The difference is not in the architecture. It is in the felt safety of the person using it.
This is the limit the paradox reaches. Stillness is restorative, and stillness is destabilizing. And both claims are accurate, and neither cancels the other. The variable is not the stillness itself, but the conditions under which a particular person encounters it. And those conditions, the accumulated suppression, the unresolved loops, the sustained low-level threat response, are precisely the things that chronic tiredness tends to produce and sustain. Which means the person who most needs the restoration that stillness can offer is often the person who is least positioned to access it, because the tiredness that brings them to stillness has also created the conditions under which stillness turns against them. There is no comfortable exit from this. The suggestion that you simply need to develop greater felt safety before attempting stillness is accurate in principle and mostly useless in practice, because felt safety is not a precondition you can manufacture by deciding to. It is a state that accumulates through specific experiences over time, through predictability, through relational security, through the gradual resolution of what has been suppressed. Telling someone to achieve felt safety before they rest is telling them to be less exhausted before they try to rest. The circularity does not resolve, it simply clarifies how thoroughly the problem is structured against easy intervention. The Stoics had a particular account of why people suffer. Marcus Aurelius returned to it constantly across the Meditations, and Epictetus built his entire teaching around it. The source of human distress in this framework is attachment to outcomes outside your control, wanting circumstances to be other than they are, wanting people to behave differently, wanting the world to accommodate the shape of your desires. The exhaustion that follows this wanting is real and specific. It is the cost of continuous friction between what is and what you insist should be. Every moment spent in that friction is energy spent on something that cannot move. Reality, as it has already happened, as it currently exists. The Stoic prescription is not suppression. It is a reorientation of attention toward what is actually within your domain, which is the quality and character of your own response. Do that correctly, and the friction dissolves. The energy that was being consumed by resistance becomes available again. What the Stoic diagnosis captures is something observable. There is a kind of tiredness that genuinely does track the intensity of wanting. The person who needs a particular outcome badly, who has made their sense of stability contingent on something they cannot guarantee, arrives at rest carrying that need with them. The need does not pause because the activity has paused. It continues running as a background process, consuming whatever cognitive and emotional resources the rest was supposed to restore. Reduce the need, reduce the attachment, and the background process quiets. The Stoic claim is not mystical. It is a description of where certain kinds of energy actually go. But then, the existentialists looked at the same phenomenon and described a completely different mechanism. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus. Their accounts vary, but they converge on a related diagnosis. The source of a particular kind of depletion is not attachment to outcomes. It is the performance of a life that does not genuinely belong to you. Living in bad faith, Sartre's term for the condition of acting as though your identity is fixed, your roles are given, and your choices are not really choices, produces a specific kind of weight. It is not the weight of wanting too much. It is the weight of being too little of yourself for too long. The exhaustion here comes from inauthenticity, from the sustained maintenance of a self that was built to satisfy external expectations rather than internal ones. The prescription that follows is not detachment from outcomes. It is the opposite movement, toward ownership, toward the acknowledgement that you are choosing, even when choosing feels like following, and toward the responsibility that comes with that acknowledgement. These are serious disagreements. They agree that something about the structure of a person's relationship to their own life generates a tiredness that has nothing to do with the physical expenditure of the day. That point of convergence is significant. When two traditions that rarely agree on first principles both arrive at the observation that a particular kind of exhaustion originates in how a person stands in relation to their existence, not what they have done, but the posture with which they have inhabited their hours. It is worth taking seriously as a claim about what tiredness actually is. The fatigue is not in the muscles or the sleep debt. It is in the orientation. Where they intersect more precisely is in their shared rejection of the idea that external circumstances are the primary cause of this kind of depletion. The Stoic does not say, "You are tired because your life is difficult." The existentialist does not say, "You are tired because your circumstances are constraining." Both locate the source somewhere inside the relationship between the person and the conditions they inhabit, in how that person is relating to what is happening, not simply in what is happening. The exhaustion that interests both traditions is the kind that persists regardless of objective circumstances, that follows people into ease, that survives improved conditions because its source is not in the conditions. You can recognize that kind of tiredness. It does not respond to improvement of the situation. When things get better, it remains. That is partly how you know it is what both traditions are describing. The unresolved region between them is where the question becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The Stoic prescription and the existentialist prescription point in nearly opposite directions. Stoicism counsels a certain withdrawal of investment, a drawing back from outcomes, a deliberate loosening of the grip on what you want things to be. Existentialism counsels an intensification of investment, a deeper engagement with what you actually want, a more honest confrontation with whether the life you are living reflects your own choices or someone else's template. Applied to the same exhausted person, these prescriptions produce incompatible guidance. Detach more, says one. Commit more honestly, says the other. And here is what makes this more than a theoretical dispute. Many people who are chronically tired are not clearly in one category or the other. The tiredness of excessive attachment and the tiredness of inauthenticity can coexist in the same person, and the proportions may be unknowable from inside the experience. If you are depleted by wanting a particular life to look a particular way, and that particular way happens to be a life that would actually be more genuinely yours, then the Stoic advice to loosen your grip is the wrong medicine. You are not attached to something external. You are trying to reach something that belongs to you and being exhausted by the distance. Applying detachment to that condition would increase the inauthenticity, which would increase the tiredness the existentialist names, which would make everything worse in a way that would be difficult to trace back to the prescription. Conversely, if the thing you are wearing yourself out pursuing is itself a performance, a goal constructed from absorbed expectations rather than actual desire, then the existentialist instruction to commit more honestly to what you want requires first knowing what you want, and that knowledge may not be available to you yet. The inauthentic life does not announce itself as inauthentic. It announces itself as your life, the one you are supposed to be living, the one with the right external markers. The inauthenticity is not felt as inauthenticity. It is felt as obscure dissatisfaction, as a tiredness without a clear referent, as the sense that something is wrong without the ability to name what. Both traditions are serious about this difficulty. Marcus Aurelius was not naive about the effort required to genuinely practice Stoic detachment. He wrote the Meditations to himself as private discipline, not as instructions he had already mastered. Sartre was not suggesting that bad faith is easily escaped, or that the recognition of your own freedom immediately produces the ability to act from it. Both frameworks are honest that the movement toward their respective prescriptions is a sustained practice, not a decision.
What remains unresolved between them is also unresolved for the person experiencing the tiredness they both describe. The question of whether your exhaustion originates in holding too tightly or in living too loosely from yourself, in too much attachment or too little authenticity, is not a question that resolves neatly on inspection. And the consequence of not being able to answer it is that the prescriptions available from both traditions remain simultaneously plausible and potentially counterproductive, depending on which diagnosis is actually correct for your particular case. The tiredness continues while the correct interpretation stays uncertain. That uncertainty is not an intellectual puzzle. It is itself a weight. There is a version of exhaustion that produces no visible evidence of itself. You finish a day, try to account for what made it hard, and find nothing you can point to. No difficult task was completed. No major demand was made. The hours passed, and yet something was spent. Something that did not accumulate into output, did not register as effort, and cannot be identified after the fact. This is the particular texture of social performance fatigue. It does not show up in any record of what you did, because what you did, in the conventional sense, was nothing unusual. You spoke to people. You were present in rooms. You navigated ordinary interactions with ordinary competence. And you are exhausted in a way that makes no sense if you calculate it by the weight of the visible tasks. The assumption that tends to operate here is that tiredness is proportional to observable effort, that if you have not done much, you have not spent much, that the body and mind run a fairly honest accounting, exertion in, fatigue out, and if the exertion was light, the fatigue should be correspondingly light. This assumption feels self-evident. It is also, for a specific and under-examined category of tiredness, entirely wrong. Social performance fatigue does not follow the exertion-to-fatigue ratio, because what is being expended during social performance is not the kind of energy that maps onto task completion. The work being done is regulatory work.
continuous, real-time adjustments to how you present, what you reveal, what you suppress, which version of yourself you make legible in which room. Code switching requires holding two or more registers simultaneously, the one that would emerge naturally and the one that is appropriate to the context. Emotional masking requires generating a visible surface that does not match the interior, which means sustaining a gap between two states at once. Role maintenance across different contexts requires tracking which self is expected where and suppressing the bleed-through when elements from one context would be unwelcome in another. None of this is announced as effort while it is happening. It runs largely below the threshold of conscious attention, and it is not cheap.
Think of someone who moves between significantly different social worlds across a single day. Different registers, different expectations, different implicit rules about what kind of person it is appropriate to be. By late afternoon, the depletion this produces is substantial. It is not because they have worked hard in the conventional sense. The complication is that social performance fatigue resists detection at the personal level, not just the systemic one. Because the effort is not felt as effort while it is occurring, the person who is experiencing it does not build up a subjective record of expenditure across the day. They do not arrive at rest feeling like they have been working. They arrive feeling vaguely drained in a way they cannot attach to anything specific. This vagueness is not confusion. It is the accurate phenomenology of a cost that was incurred without being registered. The fatigue is real. The mechanism was real. The absence of felt effort is what makes both invisible. This invisibility is compounded by the social framework within which the fatigue occurs. Social performance, code switching, masking, role management, is often not a personal choice in any meaningful sense. For many people, it is the condition of functioning in environments that are not built around their natural mode of being. The performance is demanded by the context, which makes it structural rather than incidental. And structures do not generate sympathy the way visible personal effort does. When someone is tired after a physically or cognitively demanding task, the tiredness is legible. There is an account of what happened. When someone is tired after a day of managed presence in rooms that required a particular version of them that cost something to maintain, there is no account that others can read, and often no account the person themselves can produce. The consequence of this invisibility is specific. When tiredness cannot be explained, it tends to be attributed. Either the person attributes it inward, something is wrong with their constitution, their resilience, their capacity, or they feel the absence of any valid explanation as its own small pressure. Neither of these is accurate. The tiredness has a cause. The cause is just one that falls outside the categories that are legible as effort. What makes this philosophically interesting, rather than simply psychologically interesting, is that it exposes a gap in how effort and cost are conceptualized. The categories available for understanding what a day contains, tasks, demands, outputs, exertions, are built around a model of activity that is primarily visible and productive. Social performance produces nothing that can be catalogued as output. It does not complete tasks. It maintains relationships, navigates norms, sustains intelligibility across contexts, and all of these are genuinely valuable, socially and personally. But they are not outputs in the sense that productivity frameworks recognize. They leave no record, they generate no artifact, and so the energy they consume is not counted in any tally of what the day contained. This is not a minor accounting error. The energy spent on social performance fatigue is real energy, drawn from the same reserves that biological and cognitive tasks draw from. When it goes uncounted, the person trying to understand their tiredness is working from an incomplete picture of their own day. They are solving an equation while missing a significant term. The tiredness remains inexplicable because the expenditure that produced it is not visible in any of the categories they are using to look. The further complication is that social performance fatigue scales with the degree of discrepancy between the performed self and the interior one. When the gap between who you are in a room and who you are outside it is small, when the role you are maintaining is close to something you would choose anyway, the regulatory cost is lower. When the gap is substantial, when the version of yourself that the context demands is markedly different from the one that feels natural or genuine, the cost of maintaining that gap over time is correspondingly higher. This means that the people who carry the heaviest social performance fatigue are often the people for whom the contexts they must navigate are the most distant from their natural mode of being. The fatigue indexes something real about the relationship between the person and the environment. It is information. It is just information that has no obvious channel through which to be received or interpreted, because the frameworks available for understanding tiredness are not built to read it. And this is where the invisibility becomes something more than inconvenient. When a genuine expenditure cannot be explained within the available frameworks, the explanation defaults to something that can be explained, to personal deficit, to vague inadequacy, to a story about not being resilient enough to handle ordinary social life. That default is not just inaccurate, it adds a second cost to the first one. The person is tired from the social performance and then additionally burdened by the conclusion they draw from being unable to account for why. The fatigue earns an interpretation that makes it worse and obscures its actual source at the same time. When you hold something unfinished, it does not stay still. This is the first thing to understand about the particular tiredness that comes not from what you have done, but from what remains open. An unresolved situation, a conversation that ended without resolution, a decision that keeps circling back before you can commit to it, an intention that has been forming for months without becoming action, does not wait patiently in some neutral storage area of the mind. It continues demanding processing resources. It maintains a kind of low-level activation, a readiness to be attended to, a standing request for cognitive access that never quite gets fulfilled. And this request does not pause because you have stopped working. It does not suspend during sleep or quiet down on the weekend or take time off when you do.
The psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik identified something related to this in the 1920s through a series of observations about memory. Tasks that are interrupted or left incomplete are remembered more persistently than tasks that are finished. The mind, it turns out, maintains a kind of tracking system for unresolved work, not as a neutral filing function, but as an active orientation toward completion. The incomplete task stays live in a way that the completed one does not. Zeigarnik was describing a memory phenomenon, but the underlying mechanism points towards something with much wider consequences than recall. If the mind maintains heightened activation around the unfinished, and if unfinished situations are a permanent feature of ordinary life for most people, then the background consumption of energy that this represents is not occasional. It is continuous. What makes this particularly relevant to the experience of rest that does not restore is the timing. The incomplete task activation does not depend on active attention to function. You do not need to be thinking about the unresolved conversation for it to be consuming something. It runs in the background, below the threshold of conscious attention, outside the field of deliberate focus, which means it is invisible, in the same way that social performance fatigue is invisible. And for a related reason, the expenditure is not felt as effort. It does not announce itself as consumption. And so,
When you arrive at rest, having spent a day in which the foreground tasks seemed manageable, you are arriving with a background cost that was running the entire time, and that has never been included in your accounting of what the day contained. This is a different kind of invisibility than the one involved in suppression or social performance. Those involve active regulatory work. Something is being held back or maintained or managed. The cognitive load of open loops does not require the same kind of active holding. It is more like a passive drain, a sustained, low-level pull on available resources that does not intensify in any single moment, but accumulates continuously over time. You might not feel it at any given point in the day. You feel it at the end of the day, when the accumulated draw has added up to something significant. And because you cannot point to the moment when it happened, the tiredness seems disproportionate to the day's demands.
Vacation is one of the clearest surfaces on which this becomes visible, if you are paying attention. Many people report that the first several days of a break feel worse, not better. The relief they expected does not arrive. The fatigue actually intensifies before it begins to lift. One way to understand this is that the reduction in external demands simply creates more available surface area for the unresolved material to press against. The foreground tasks were, in a perverse sense, providing some competition for attention. They were drawing processing resources that might otherwise have been immediately available to the open loops. Remove the foreground demands, and the background ones become relatively louder. They do not disappear when you step away from the context in which they were created. The unresolved conversation is still unresolved, whether you are at your desk or at a different latitude. This means that rest, as a change of external context, addresses one layer of what makes tiredness accumulate, but leaves another layer entirely untouched. The layer it does not touch is the one that has nothing to do with the current activity and everything to do with what remains unfinished across the longer span of a person's life. Not just the practical open loops, the tasks not yet completed, the emails not yet sent, but the deeper ones. The relationship not yet clarified, the direction not yet committed to, the sense of something that needs to be confronted and keeps getting deferred because the moment for confronting it never quite arrives, or because the shape of the confrontation is not yet clear, or because the outcome is uncertain enough to make the approach feel dangerous. These deeper open loops carry a heavier cognitive charge than practical ones, and they are also the ones most resistant to closure. A practical, incomplete task can, in principle, be finished. You complete it, the activation resolves, the tracking system releases it. The deeper, unresolved situations often cannot be closed by action alone. They require something more like a genuine reckoning, a willingness to arrive at clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, about where something stands. And that reckoning may involve consequences that the person is not yet ready to accept. So the loop stays open. The processing resources stay allocated to it. And they stay allocated through every rest period, every sleep cycle, every vacation, because the situation that generated the activation has not changed. There is a precision worth holding on to here. The drain is not caused by thinking about the unresolved situation. It is caused by the unresolved situation existing. The person who deliberately avoids thinking about something difficult is still paying the background cost of maintaining that avoidance, which requires its own allocation of regulatory energy. The drain from open loops does not require attention, it requires the situation to remain unresolved, which means the strategies people commonly use to manage this kind of tiredness, distraction, avoidance, filling the available time with activity, do not address the source. They change the foreground. The background continues.
What this produces at the level of lived experience is a kind of tiredness that is deeply puzzling to the person experiencing it. The day was not excessive, the sleep was adequate. The weekend was, in principle, free, and yet the depletion is real and persistent, and it does not respond to the interventions that should, by any reasonable account, reduce it. The person tries to rest, and the rest does not land. The gap between the expected effect of rest and the actual experience of it generates its own additional weight, a confusion about what is happening, and often a quiet suspicion that something is wrong with them specifically, since other people seem to manage this better. That suspicion misreads the situation. The open loops are not a sign of unusual fragility. They are a structural feature of how the mind tracks commitment. The mind holds unfinished things open because, from a processing standpoint, they are unfinished. There is no internal signal that they have been resolved because they have not been. The fatigue is a consequence of that tracking system functioning exactly as it is supposed to function. The problem is not the tracking. The problem is the gap between how many significant things remain genuinely unresolved and how much of a person's available resources were already accounted for before the open loops were factored in.
And here the question becomes uncomfortable in a particular way, because some of what stays open by choice, or by the sustained deferral of a choice. The situation that keeps returning to the edges of attention during rest, the one that was not quite resolved before sleep and was back before the alarm, the one that appears reliably in the first quiet moment of a new day. It is possible that this situation stays open not because its resolution is unclear, but because its resolution requires something you are not yet willing to do, or willing to lose, or willing to become. The open loop is not always a puzzle waiting to be solved. Sometimes it is a decision waiting to be made, and the cost of not making it is not abstract. It is running right now, quietly, beneath whatever else is occupying the surface of the day. There is a claim that circulates widely enough to function almost as common sense, that tiredness, when it becomes a persistent feature of a person's life rather than a temporary condition, reflects something about that person. The claim is not usually stated explicitly. It operates as a background assumption in how persistent exhaustion is discussed, diagnosed, and responded to. If you are chronically depleted, the implicit frame suggests, the explanation lives somewhere inside you. This is a claim worth examining at scale before examining what it actually means in a specific life. At the structural level, the claim is this, that the distribution of exhaustion across a population reflects the distribution of individual weakness or mismanagement. That people who are persistently tired because of something about them: insufficient discipline, poor habits, inadequate resilience, a failure to apply the available tools for recovery correctly. The claim positions the exhausted person as the relevant unit of analysis. The system that person inhabits is not under examination. The demands placed on them by that system are not under examination. The question is, what is wrong with them, and how can they correct it? The problem with examining this claim at scale is that it immediately runs into an epidemiological difficulty. Chronic fatigue, persistent exhaustion, the sense of never quite recovering. These are not distributed randomly across the population in a way that reflects random individual variation. They cluster. They accumulate in predictable places, in people navigating structural precarity, in people whose working conditions offer minimal autonomy, in people maintaining high levels of social performance because their natural mode of being does not map cleanly onto the environments they must function in. If the explanation were primarily individual, the distribution would look different.
You would expect something closer to an even scatter across contexts and conditions. The clustering tells a different story. Now bring it down to the specific. Someone is exhausted. The day was not exceptional. They slept. They have been trying, in the ways available to them, to manage the load. And the fatigue persists. Not dramatically, not in a way that stops functioning, but as a steady background condition that does not lift. They try to account for it. The accounting produces nothing that feels sufficient. They begin, often quietly and without fully articulating it, to conclude that the problem is theirs, that they are not managing well, that something in their constitution is failing at an ordinary task that other people seem to handle without apparent difficulty.
The gap between these two levels, the structural claim and the lived individual experience, is not just an intellectual discrepancy. It generates its own specific exhaustion. When a structural condition produces an individual experience of depletion, and when the available frameworks for understanding that depletion are built entirely around individual causes, the person trying to understand what is happening to them is working from a map that does not include the territory they are actually in. The tiredness they feel is real. The efforts they make to address it are real. The persistent failure of those efforts to resolve the depletion is real. And the conclusion they draw from that failure, that they are the problem, is the conclusion that the framework makes almost inevitable, even when it is wrong. This is where a second layer of fatigue enters. The first layer is the depletion itself. Whatever combination of biological, cognitive, emotional, and social expenditure has accumulated without adequate conditions for recovery. The second layer is what happens when that depletion is attributed to personal failure. Shame is not a neutral psychological state. It is a state that carries its own energy cost, a continuous, low-level activation that affects how a person relates to themselves and to the possibility of relief. When exhaustion becomes evidence of inadequacy, seeking rest becomes entangled with shame about needing it. When the fatigue seems to reflect something wrong with you personally, every episode of tiredness reconfirms the verdict. The depletion does not simply continue, it is now compounded by the weight of the interpretation placed on it. And this second layer is particularly resistant to correction because it is largely invisible in the same way the original depletion was invisible. The person is not usually walking around thinking, "I am ashamed of being tired." The shame operates at a subtler register, in the slight reluctance to admit the extent of the fatigue, in the instinctive minimization when someone asks how they are doing, in the way that needing rest feels like a confession rather than a fact. These are small things. Their cumulative effect is not small. What this means systemically is that a culture or structure which routinely overloads individuals while attributing the resulting exhaustion to individual failure does not simply fail to address the first problem. It actively generates the second one as a structural output. The attribution of systemic cost to personal deficit is not a side effect. It is a fairly efficient mechanism for preventing the systemic source from being examined. When exhausted people conclude they are the problem, they direct their available energy toward correcting themselves, rather than toward questioning the conditions. This keeps the conditions stable. It keeps the individuals in a position of managing their response to a load whose legitimacy they have, at least partially, accepted. The philosophical dimension of this is not incidental. Questions about the correct attribution of cause, about whether suffering belongs to the person experiencing it or to the conditions that produced it, have occupied serious thinkers across very different traditions. What is distinctive about this particular case is the mechanism of misdirection. The exhaustion is real. The person is genuinely depleted. The error is not in the experience, but in the explanation.
And the explanation does not arrive from outside as an obvious imposition. It is adopted, often quietly and without resistance, because the available frameworks for understanding tiredness do not include structural causes among their primary categories. The person reaches for an explanation, finds the individual one most accessible, and uses it. The adoption is not coerced. It is the natural output of a framework that was never built to ask the structural question. The limit of this generalization is worth sitting with. The claim that persistent exhaustion reflects structural conditions rather than individual failure is not absolute. There are cases where individual patterns, the loops held open by choice, the regulatory costs incurred through habitual suppression, the rumination that accelerates in silence, are genuinely the primary source of the depletion. The structural argument does not dissolve personal agency or render individual responses irrelevant. What it does is shift the order of inquiry. Before concluding that the tired person is failing at a manageable task, it is worth asking what the task actually is, who designed it, and whether the conditions surrounding it were ever built with genuine recovery in mind. What remains open, and what the attribution to personal failure framing is specifically designed to prevent from being opened, is the question of whether the load is legitimate. Whether the conditions that generate the exhaustion are simply given, or whether they are chosen arrangements that could, in principle, be arranged differently. That question is not comfortable because it does not have a simple individual answer. It does not resolve into a change you can make alone. And the exhaustion it points toward is not the kind that responds to better sleep hygiene or a more intentional morning routine. It is the kind that is waiting for a different question to be asked, and for someone, somewhere in the relevant system, to be willing to hear the answer.
The self does not present as one thing. This is the rule, the basic condition of being a person living inside multiple contexts simultaneously. You are not the same in every room you enter. The register shifts, the emphasis shifts, the aspects of you that are visible and the ones that stay out of frame shift. This is not pathology, and it is not pretense. It is the ordinary structure of social existence. The question worth pressing on is what that ordinary structure actually costs, not in any single interaction, but as a continuous physiological and psychological expenditure that runs without interruption across the entire span of a waking life. The cost is rarely framed as a cost at all. When psychologists and philosophers discuss identity, the emphasis tends to fall on coherence, the degree to which a person maintains a stable sense of who they are across contexts. Coherence is treated as the healthy outcome, and fragmentation as the problem to be avoided. What this framing underweights is the work involved in producing that coherence, or in managing the experience of its absence. A person holding multiple self-images that do not map cleanly onto each other is not simply experiencing a philosophical puzzle. They are running a continuous reconciliation process, testing each context against the available versions of themselves, adjusting presentation, monitoring for inconsistency, managing the internal gap between what is expressed and what is felt. That process does not pause between contexts. It runs during the transitions. It runs during rest. There is a precise way to understand what fragmentation costs energetically. The nervous system does not operate in neat compartments. The version of you that performs competence at work does not switch cleanly off when you leave the building. The self-presentation sustained throughout the day does not dissolve the moment external demands are removed. Something more gradual happens, a slow decompression that takes time, and that during its unfolding still carries some residual activation from the sustained maintenance work. If the versions of self required by different contexts are not in tension, this decompression can proceed relatively smoothly. If they are in tension, if what is required in one context
actively contradicts what feels true in another. The decompression itself becomes a site of conflict. The person arrives at rest already mid-process, already in the middle of a reconciliation they cannot complete, because the contexts generating the contradiction are both ongoing.
Someone who presents warmth and patience in a caregiving role at home and is required to sustain authority and detachment in a professional role is not simply adjusting their tone between contexts. They are maintaining two distinct emotional stances that draw on incompatible internal orientations. The cost of each, held individually, might be manageable. The cost of holding both simultaneously, of being always in partial transition between them, of never being fully in either, that cost compounds. It does not add linearly, it multiplies across the number of significant contradictions in play. The invisibility of this cost follows a pattern that has appeared several times already in considering different forms of exhaustion. Identity maintenance does not look like effort because it does not produce observable output. There is no artifact of the reconciliation work, no record of the energy spent managing the gap between selves. What is visible is the result. The person showing up in each context and functioning in the role required there. The functioning is the output. The maintenance work that makes the functioning possible is the invisible input. And because it is invisible, it is routinely excluded from any accounting of what the person has done in a day, what they have spent, what they might need in order to recover. The philosophical literature on this specific cost is thinner than the weight of the experience warrants. William James, writing at the turn of the 20th century, noted that a person has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize them, each relationship calling forth a somewhat different presentation. James treated this multiplicity largely as a feature of human social life, not primarily as a problem. The strain that multiplicity can generate did not occupy the center of his analysis. It is in the work of later thinkers in different registers, in phenomenological accounts of the effort of self-presentation, in sociological analyses of performance and role, that the energetic dimension begins to receive more serious attention. Irving Goffman's framework of social performance, developed across the 1950s and 60s, was not primarily about exhaustion either, but the logic of his analysis points toward it. If ordinary social interaction requires the continuous management of impressions, the staging of a self that can withstand the scrutiny of others, then interaction is not merely social exchange. It is labor, uncompensated, unacknowledged, and ongoing. What makes identity fragmentation a specifically modern intensification of this older dynamic is not that people now present differently in different contexts, they always have, but that the number of distinct contexts requiring distinct presentations has expanded considerably, and that several of those contexts now extend into spaces that were previously unstructured. The self you maintain online is a context that did not exist in this form 30 years ago. It is a context with its own audience, its own norms, its own requirements for consistency, and its own relationship to the offline selves that overlap with it or diverge from it. The person managing a professional identity online that does not fully align with the person they are at home, or the person they were before the professional identity solidified, that person is managing an additional reconciliation that their parents' generation did not face in quite the same way. The fragmentation has more surfaces now. The reconciliation work has more fronts. The tension this produces at the level of lived experience is less like internal conflict in a dramatic sense, and more like a low-grade structural strain.
Nothing is overtly wrong in any single context. Each version of the self is functioning. The role is being maintained. The performance, by external measures, is adequate or better than adequate. The strain is in the gap between the performing self and whatever underlies it, in the accumulated sense that the presentation is not quite continuous with anything that feels fully real. That gap does not have to be large to be costly. It simply has to persist, and it persists as long as the contexts generating the contradiction remain active simultaneously, which, in most people's lives, is more or less always. Rest does not dissolve this. A weekend does not close the gap between the professional self and the intimate self if both contexts resume on Monday and continue to require incompatible things. Sleep does not complete the reconciliation. The tired person, waking up from adequate sleep and feeling still depleted, is not, in this case, experiencing a failure of their sleep architecture or a deficit of duration. They are experiencing the resumption of a reconciliation process that was still running when they fell asleep and that picked up again before the alarm. The tiredness is not a residue of what they did yesterday. It is a consequence of what they are carrying continuously. The gap between the selves the world requires and the self that would require no management at all. That last self, the one that would need no reconciliation, no monitoring, no adjustment for context, is not a fantasy of psychological wholeness. It is a reference point. Its absence is what the fragmented self is perpetually measuring itself against, even when that measurement is not conscious. The energy spent in the measurement, in the continuous implicit comparison between the performed self and whatever feels more fundamental, is energy that does not appear anywhere in the accounting. It does not show up as exhaustion caused by a specific event. It shows up as a tiredness that is already present when the day begins, already present when rest should be doing its work, already present as a kind of background fact about what it costs to be this particular person moving through this particular arrangement of contexts and demands. There is a partial resolution available here, and it is worth naming precisely so that its limits are also visible. The partial resolution is recognition, not as a therapeutic act and not as a reassurance, but as a basic perceptual correction, identifying that a real cost exists, that it has a real sort, and that the source is structural rather than a sign of inadequate constitution. This recognition does not close the gap between selves. It does not reduce the number of contexts or eliminate the contradictions between them. What it does is remove the second layer of cost that arrives when the first layer, the actual fragmentation and its actual expenditure, is attributed to personal failing. Recognizing that the tiredness has an identifiable structural cause does not fix the tiredness. It stops the tiredness from also being evidence of something wrong with you, and that is not nothing, even though it is also not enough.
There is a form of tiredness that does not come from doing too much. It comes from spending long stretches of time inside a life that does not feel entirely real, filling the hours with actions that are functional, even necessary, but that carry no particular sense of having been chosen, of belonging to something that could be called yours. The fatigue this produces is quiet and persistent, and extremely difficult to name, because from the outside, the life looks operational. From the inside, it feels like inhabiting a room where the furniture is arranged correctly, but nothing in it is familiar. This is what I want to stay with here, not exhaustion as depletion from overexertion, and not the specific costs already examined in the labor of social performance or the fragmentation of identity across contexts. Something more foundational than any of those. The question is what it costs to move through time in a way that does not cohere into the experience
of a life actually being lived. The philosophical tradition has a word adjacent to this, alienation, but the word has accumulated so many uses across different frameworks that it no longer lands with precision. What is being described is narrower and more personal than alienation in its sociological sense. It is not primarily about being estranged from the products of your labor, or from other people, or from society in the abstract. It is about the specific fatigue of performing existence rather than inhabiting it, of going through sequences of days that produce no felt sense of forward movement, no accumulating texture of a life that is yours, no connection between what fills the hours and what the person carrying those hours actually recognizes as mattering to them. Albert Camus wrote about this without calling it tiredness, but the phenomenological content is close. The absurd, in his account, is the gap between the human need for meaning and the world's refusal to provide it on terms the human can accept. The person confronting the absurd does not stop functioning. They continue to wake up, to work, to move through the ordinary motions of a day. What has happened is that the motions have lost their transparent necessity, the sense that this is obviously what life is and what it requires. The question Camus was circling was not how to fill the gap, but whether the gap could be acknowledged without collapsing into either despair or false consolation. What he did not center, but what follows directly from the structure of his argument, is what the sustained presence of that gap costs energetically. Because the person holding the gap open, continuing to function while knowing the function has no guaranteed meaning, is doing something. That something is not nothing. It does not appear as output, and it does not appear in any accounting of what the day contained, but it is a continuous expenditure, and its cumulative weight is the specific form of tiredness being examined here. You have probably felt something in this vicinity without having a name for it. Not the acute collapse of someone who has done too much, not the ache of a particularly demanding week, but something more ambient. The sense of arriving at the end of a day that was not objectively difficult and still feeling drained in a way that a night of sleep will not address. The absence of anything that could be pointed to as the cause. The slight unreality of the hours just past, as though they were happening to someone roughly like you, rather than to you specifically.
What makes this form of tiredness distinct from depression, which it superficially resembles, is that it does not necessarily alter affect in the clinical sense. The person experiencing it is not necessarily unable to feel pleasure, or unable to function, or carrying the characteristic weight of depressive thought. They may laugh genuinely, feel moments of warmth, handle the practical demands of the day competently. The unreality is more specific. It attaches to the relationship between the actions being performed and the self performing them, rather than to the quality of experience in any particular moment. The hours feel unreal because they do not feel authored, because the life they constitute does not feel like something that was arrived at through a series of genuine choices that reflected what this particular person actually values. The distinction from what is typically called burnout is equally important to hold clearly. Burnout describes a recognizable progression, high investment followed by depletion, the erosion of capacity through sustained overcommitment in a specific domain, and the before state usually involves genuine engagement. The tiredness being described here can be present without that arc. It does not require prior enthusiasm. It can be the condition of someone who has been doing more or less what they are doing for a long time, without a point of collapse and without an obvious cause. It is structural rather than progressive. It is the fatigue of a configuration, not the aftermath of an event. The psychological mechanism at work is related to what some theorists have called self-alienation at the motivational level.
the gradual divergence between what a person actually values and what their daily actions express. This divergence does not have to be dramatic. It does not require that the person is doing something they actively oppose. It is enough that what fills the hours is simply adjacent to what they value, close enough not to be experienced as a betrayal, distant enough to accumulate as a kind of residue. Each day deposits a small amount. The deposit is almost imperceptible at the scale of a single day. Over months and years, the accumulation becomes the primary texture of the person's relationship to their own existence. The energy cost of this is not obvious to map, because it does not involve sustained exertion in any conventional sense. What it involves is the continuous, low-level work of being present in a life that does not quite feel like yours, showing up to it, performing its requirements, maintaining enough investment to function adequately, while something underneath is registering a persistent mismatch. That registration is not passive. It is a running comparison, an implicit, continuous measurement of the distance between what is and what would constitute a life genuinely recognized as one's own. And like any continuous process running in the background, it consumes resources. It consumes them quietly, without announcing itself, without producing anything that could be pointed to as output.
Rest does not interrupt this. Sleep restores certain capacities, the nervous system recovers, cognitive processing clears, the body repairs what accumulated fatigue has degraded. What sleep does not touch is the configuration itself. You wake up restored in the narrow biological sense and immediately resume inhabiting the same arrangement of hours, the same sequence of actions, with the same relationship to what you actually value, the same ambient sense that the life being lived is somehow happening at a slight remove from whoever is living it. The tiredness returns quickly because it was never located where the sleep could reach it. What is philosophically significant about this form of exhaustion is that it is not responsive to the usual categories of remedy. More sleep does not address it. Reduced workload does not address it, because the fatigue is not primarily about volume. Better self-care practices, more intentional recovery rituals, improved sleep hygiene. These are responses calibrated to a different problem. The person applying them to existential tiredness is working with tools designed for a different kind of depletion, and their failure to produce relief is not evidence of the person's inadequate application. It is evidence of a category error. The category error is easy to make because the experience of this tiredness and the experience of ordinary biological fatigue share a surface presentation. The person is tired. They need rest. They rest. They remain tired. The loop repeats. At no point in the loop is there a clear diagnostic signal that would indicate the tiredness is not about exertion or recovery at all, that it is about the specific quality of a life being lived in a way that the person living it does not fully recognize as real. And without that diagnostic clarity, the available responses are the obvious ones. More rest, better rest, more deliberate management of the conditions around rest, none of which touches the source.
What the source actually requires is a different question entirely. And that question is harder and less comfortable, and does not have a practical answer that can be extracted from a wellness framework or applied over a weekend. The person who recognizes that their persistent tiredness is existential rather than biological is not thereby freed from it. The recognition changes what the problem is. It does not change the problem. The gap between what fills the hours and what would constitute a life genuinely chosen and genuinely recognized as one's own, that gap does not close through recognition alone. It closes, if it closes at all, through something far more demanding, through actual change in the configuration, through choices that carry real costs, through the sustained and uncertain work of constructing
or reconstructing a relationship between daily existence and whatever it is that actually matters to the person living it. That work is not restful, and whether it is available, whether the conditions of a life permit it, whether the person has the resources, the freedom, the clarity to undertake it, is a question that cannot be answered in the abstract and cannot be answered for you from the outside. The wellness industry did not invent the idea that rest requires tending. That idea is old and, on its own terms, reasonable. What is more recent is the transformation of that idea into a market, the conversion of recovery into a category of consumption, with its own products, its own credentialed practitioners, its own visual language of linen and candlelight and carefully chosen silence. The industry exists because the need is real. People are genuinely exhausted and genuinely searching for relief. The problem is not that the search is happening. The problem is the specific form the industry's answer takes, and what that form does to the person who accepts it. The core of the recovery industry's logic is this: restoration is something you acquire. You acquire it through the right practices, the right products, the right allocation of time according to the right principles. Rest becomes a discipline with correct and incorrect executions. Recovery becomes a project with better and worse outcomes. The exhausted person enters this framework as a consumer in need of the appropriate inputs, and the framework's function is to supply them. This sounds like help. It is structured as help. The question worth pressing is whether it actually disrupts the cycle of exhaustion or whether its structure quietly extends it.
Consider what position the framework places the exhausted person in. They arrive depleted. The framework identifies their depletion as a deficit of the right kind of rest, not enough of it, or the wrong quality, or executed without sufficient intentionality. The remedy offered is a more correctly performed version of recovery. The person accepts this framing and attempts the correction. They invest in the inputs the industry specifies. All of these are forms of expenditure, which means the person attempting to recover is also simultaneously producing. They are producing a recovery, generating the output of having rested correctly, having consumed the appropriate tools, having executed the rituals with adequate commitment, and producing, even when what is being produced is recovery itself, keeps the person in the position of someone whose value is tied to output. The position that tiredness originally came from, this is the structural trap. The recovery industry addresses the surface presentation of exhaustion, the need for rest, the deficit of restoration, without touching the underlying dynamic that makes genuine recovery impossible, which is that the person has been organized around production, performance, and the continuous generation of adequate output for so long that they can no longer enter a state that is not also a performance. The industry does not disrupt this organization. It incorporates itself into it. It gives the performance a new domain, the performance of recovering well. And in doing so, it extends the reach of the same logic that produced the exhaustion into the one territory that might have been exempt from it. You can observe this in the specific language the industry uses. Rest is described as a practice. Recovery is described as a skill. Restoration is described as something you get better at, with time and proper guidance. Each of these formulations carries within it the implicit assumption that there is a correct way to do this, which means there is also an incorrect way, which means the person attempting recovery is also always at risk of doing it wrong. That risk does not disappear during rest. It accompanies rest. It is the background condition under which the recovery attempt is made, and it ensures that even in the designated spaces of restoration, the self-monitoring does not go offline. Because How could it, when the recovery itself is now a performance with standards?
The philosophical dimension of this becomes clear when you consider what genuine rest would actually require. Not rest as a scheduled activity with measurable outcomes, but rest as a state in which the self is genuinely not producing. Not monitored, not optimized, not oriented toward any output, including the output of having rested adequately. That state requires, at minimum, the suspension of evaluation. The person would need to not be assessing their recovery as it occurs. They would need to be in it rather than watching themselves be in it. The industry's framework, by making recovery into a project with better and worse executions, makes exactly this suspension structurally impossible. You cannot evaluate whether you are resting correctly and simultaneously be in the condition of not evaluating. The act of monitoring whether you are resting well is the act of not resting. This connects directly to what has already been established about self-monitoring as invisible labor. The background process of tracking how you appear, to others, to yourself, against a standard, does not pause because the context has shifted to a recovery-designated space. If anything, in a context explicitly organized around recovery, the monitoring has a new target. The question is no longer only how you appear in professional or social contexts, but whether your recovery is going well, whether you are doing it correctly, whether the investment in the right inputs is producing the right outputs. The self-monitoring has colonized the recovery attempt, and the energy expenditure that the recovery was supposed to address is now also running inside the recovery. The commodification of rest would be a narrower problem if it were simply ineffective. Ineffective remedies are common enough, and the person who tries them and finds they do not work can, in principle, look elsewhere. What makes this more structurally significant is that the framework is not simply neutral in its failure. It actively shapes how the exhausted person understands their exhaustion. By locating the problem in an insufficiency of correct recovery, not enough, or the wrong kind, or executed without adequate skill, the framework places the cause of persistent tiredness back inside the person. You are still tired because you have not yet learned to rest properly. You are still depleted because you have not yet found the right combination of inputs. The industry's explanation for why its solutions do not work is the same as its original diagnosis. The individual is the site of the problem, and the solution is more and better individual effort. This is the mechanism through which the recovery industry reinforces the condition it claims to address. The exhausted person who accepts the framework does not only fail to recover, they also receive a new account of their failure that returns them, again, to the position of someone who has not done enough, not done it correctly, not applied the right discipline to the right domain. The industry does not need to intend this outcome for the outcome to follow from its structure. The structure is sufficient. Recovery as consumption, rest as a discipline, restoration as something you can do better or worse. These framings, taken together, are enough to ensure that the person seeking recovery through this framework will remain, at the level of their relationship to their own exhaustion, in exactly the position the framework was built to profit from. What the industry does not supply, cannot supply by its nature, because it would dissolve the commercial relationship, is the possibility that the tiredness is not a deficit at all, that it is not caused by an insufficiency of recovery, does not require a better executed rest, and cannot be addressed by any version of consuming more correctly targeted inputs. The possibility that the exhaustion is not about what has been consumed or how well the recovery has been performed, that it is pointing somewhere else entirely, towards something in the configuration of the life itself, is a possibility the industry's framework systematically forecloses. Because if that possibility were taken seriously, the exhausted person would stop being a consumer of recovery products and start being someone asking a different kind of question. A question whose answer is not available for purchase and whose pursuit leads away from the industry entirely. That question is not yet the subject here, but its outline is already visible in the shape of what the industry cannot offer, and in the persistent tiredness of people who have consumed everything the industry has, correctly and intentionally, and with full commitment, and woken up the next morning still carrying the same weight they carried in. Two traditions have been circling the question of tiredness for a long time, and they have never fully agreed on what they found. The Stoic account begins with attachment. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the 2nd century to no audience but himself, returned again and again to a single observation: that the suffering a person carries is proportional not to what happens to them, but to the resistance they maintain against what happens. The tired person in this framing is someone whose energy is being consumed by the continuous work of wanting things to be other than they are, wanting the circumstances to relent, wanting the demands to ease, wanting the conditions of the day to match some inner image of how the day should go. That wanting is not passive, it is effortful. It runs in the background of every hour, a constant low-level friction between what is and what the person insists should be. And it costs something every hour it runs. Sleep does not interrupt this friction, because the orientation that produces it does not pause when the eyes close. The Stoic prescription follows from the diagnosis: reduce attachment, reduce resistance, and the energy expenditure that was being directed at the impossible project of making the world cooperate begins to return.
This is a serious account. Its logic is coherent, and its observational basis is real. There is something genuinely recognizable in the tiredness of someone who cannot stop fighting their own circumstances. But the prescription it generates and the existentialist account generate from the same human situation something almost entirely opposite. Jean-Paul Sartre's framework begins not with attachment to outcomes, but with the weight of inauthenticity, the fatigue that accumulates when a person is living in bad faith, performing a life that was not genuinely chosen, inhabiting a role that has been absorbed from the outside rather than constructed from within. The tiredness in this account is not the cost of wanting too much. It is the cost of having accepted too little, of having settled into a definition of oneself borrowed from others, from family expectation, social pressure, professional category, cultural default, and then having spent years generating the output that definition requires, without ever having asked whether the definition was accurate, whether it was chosen, whether it fit. The exhaustion is the weight of the performed self, the self that exists to satisfy the requirements of a role rather than to inhabit an identity genuinely arrived at. And the Sartrean prescription is, in some respects, the Stoic one's structural inverse. Not less wanting, but more. More willingness to confront the freedom that the performed self was constructed to avoid. More willingness to take responsibility for the fact that the life you are living is the life you have been choosing, even when the choosing felt like passivity.
These are two serious accounts of what tiredness is, and they cannot be reconciled by choosing the right one, because the conditions they each describe are both real, and they can coexist in the same person and the same exhaustion. The person who is depleted by their resistance to circumstances may simultaneously be living a life they did not genuinely choose, which means both the attachment and the inauthenticity are operating at once, which means the two diagnoses are each partially correct, and the two prescriptions are each partially irrelevant taken alone. Releasing attachment without examining whether the life being accepted was ever actually yours, whether the reduction of resistance is acceptance or surrender, does not resolve the existentialist problem. It may deepen it. And taking responsibility for freedom, confronting the authentic self, refusing bad faith, without also examining the quality of the wanting that drives you once you step outside the performed role, does not resolve the Stoic problem. It may redirect the same exhausting friction toward a new set of uncooperative circumstances. The point of intersection between these two traditions is narrower than the distance between them might suggest. Both locate the source of tiredness inside the relationship between a person and their own life, rather than in the volume of demands that life contains. Both reject, implicitly, the idea that the solution is simply rest, more of it, better arranged, more efficiently delivered. Both are saying, each in its own register, that the question of why you are tired is a question about the structure of how you are living, and that until that structure is examined, the tiredness has nowhere else to go. The Stoic says, examine what you are attached to and what that attachment costs. The existentialist says, examine what you have accepted and what that acceptance has displaced. Both are, at the deepest level, redirecting the question of tiredness away from the surface of the symptom and toward the person carrying it. What remains unresolved between them, and this is where the real difficulty is whether the examination they each call for leads to the same kind of change. Stoic practice points toward a reorientation of desire, a cultivation of equanimity, a shift in the quality of engagement with whatever the life contains. Existentialist practice points toward a confrontation with freedom that may require dismantling arrangements rather than reorienting within them. The first path runs through the self's relationship to the world. The second runs through the self's relationship to itself. These are different territories, and the person who needs to travel both simultaneously has no single map that covers the full terrain.
You arrive then at a situation where two of the most rigorous philosophical accounts of human tiredness agree on the diagnosis at the level of principle. This is not primarily a physical problem, it is a structural one, and the structure lives inside how you are organized in relation to your own existence, and diverge at the level of what to do about it in a way that cannot be smoothed over. The divergence is not a flaw in either tradition, it reflects something true about the problem, that tiredness of this kind does not have a single sort, and the configurations that produce it are not uniform. What the Stoic is describing and what the existentialist is describing are both real forms of exhaustion, and they require genuinely different responses, and the person who is carrying both cannot simply apply one school's prescription and expect it to reach the other school's territory. What this means in practice for the person who wakes up tired despite adequate sleep, who has rested and recovered and consumed the industry's offerings and still carries the same unnameable weight, is that the question of what the tiredness is pointing toward does not have a single answer waiting to be discovered. It has a direction. Toward the structure of the life, toward the quality of the wanting, toward the relationship between what is being done and who is doing it. Both traditions are pointing at roughly the same horizon from different starting positions, with different tools, and neither has arrived at the destination cleanly. The tiredness remains, as a structure, intact. What has shifted is the frame through which it can be examined, and whether that shift is the beginning of something or simply another way of being more precisely lost is a question neither philosophy can settle in advance. There is a question that has been moving through everything said here, never quite answered, always present in the shape of the material surrounding it. The question is whether the tiredness is yours.
a failure of something in your constitution, your resilience, your capacity to manage the demands of a life, or whether it is a signal, an information-bearing state generated by conditions that are genuinely exhausting, pointing towards something that no amount of better-arranged sleep will reach. That question has been held open deliberately, because closing it too early would have falsified it. The honest answer is that it cannot be fully closed, and understanding why that is so matters more than pretending otherwise. Here is what the preceding hours of thought have established, held together without recapping it piece by piece. Rest and recovery operate on different systems, and rest can occur without recovery when the conditions recovery requires, felt safety, suspended evaluation, genuine discontinuation of performance, are absent. The nervous system can log adequate sleep, while the threat detection architecture remains online, producing the specific exhaustion of a body that rested and a self that did not. The cost of suppression, of emotions held, reactions managed, desires deferred, is heavier and more persistent than the cost of action, because it requires continuous expenditure with no release point. Self-monitoring, the background process of tracking how you appear to yourself and to others, runs as invisible labor that is never counted and never interrupted, not even by designated recovery. Meaning debt accumulates silently when action is systematically decoupled from value, depleting something at the level of identity rather than at the level of tissue. Open loops drain continuously, indifferent to whether you are sleeping or on vacation. The colonization of the recovery window means the unstructured intervals that historically served cognitive restoration have been converted into the most commercially contested terrain of human attention. The recovery industry, by making rest into a project with correct and incorrect executions, has incorporated itself into the same logic of performance it claims to interrupt, and has returned, reliably, the exhausted person to the position of someone who has not yet done enough.
And then the two philosophical traditions that have been examining this for centuries, one saying that tiredness is the cost of resistance, of attachment to circumstances that will not cooperate. The other saying it is the weight of inauthenticity, of a life assembled from borrowed definitions, rather than genuinely arrived at choices. Both serious, both pointing at the structure of the life, rather than at the volume of its demands, neither reaching the other's territory, neither sufficient on its own. What emerges from holding all of this at once is not a solution. It is a reorientation of the question. The question, why am I still tired after resting, contains an assumption that rest, properly executed, should be sufficient, and that its failure is a problem to be corrected by adjusting the execution. What the preceding material has done, cumulatively, is displace that assumption. The tiredness that does not lift after rest is not necessarily the tiredness of insufficient recovery. It may be the tiredness of suppression that has nowhere to release. It may be the tiredness of self-monitoring that has never gone offline long enough for the underlying state to surface. It may be the tiredness of meaning debt, of open loops, of identity fragmentation, of performing a self across multiple contradictory contexts without reconciliation. It may be the tiredness of a life that does not feel fully real, of hours that do not feel chosen, of a self that is present in the body, but somewhere else in every way that matters. These are not conditions that a better sleep protocol reaches. They are not conditions the right candle or the right morning routine addresses. They are conditions that require a different kind of question. Not, how do I recover from this? But, what is this? And where is it coming from? And what would it take for the thing generating it to actually change?
The discomfort of that question is real. It does not offer the relief of a corrective action. It does not come with a product, a practice, or a clearly delimited task. It points toward the structure of the life itself, toward what is being sustained, what is being suppressed, what is being performed, what is being avoided by the continuous motion of adequate output. Asking it seriously may mean arriving at things that are inconvenient or frightening or structurally resistant to quick resolution. It may mean recognizing that the tiredness has been accurate all along, that it has been correctly reporting the cost of arrangements that are genuinely costly, and that the reason rest has not resolved it is that rest was never going to reach the source. Whether the tiredness is yours or a signal is finally a false division. It is both. The tiredness is genuinely in you. You are the one carrying it, the one who wakes with it, the one whose days it colors. And it is also genuinely informational. It is generated by something. It is pointing at something. It is the organism's continuous report on the conditions under which the self is being asked to operate. The question is not which of these is true. The question is whether you are willing to take the information seriously, not as a mandate to act immediately, not as a condemnation of the life you have built, but as something worth sitting with long enough to hear what it is actually saying, underneath the fatigue and the habit of managing it, and the industry's confident assurances that the right inputs will finally make it stop.
That is where the thinking leaves you. Not with an answer that dissolves the weight, with a clearer sense of what the weight might be reporting, and a slightly more honest relationship to the question of whether you have been asking it or avoiding it. The two are easy to confuse, especially when the avoiding looks from the outside exactly like searching. Good night.